The wind in the high timber basin had teeth, and in late autumn, it used them. It bit through the canvas of Lane Mercer's coat, gnawed at the cracked leather of his gloves, and tore across the sea of bleached foxtail grass with a sound like 1,000 whispering ghosts. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, low and heavy, promising a storm that would come too early and stay too long. It smelled of snow and wet earth. Lane, at 36, looked a decade older, a man carved from the very landscape he occupied. His face was a roadmap of sun and sorrow, with lines etched around his eyes from squinting into Montana horizons and a grim set to his mouth that had become permanent. He moved with the stiff, deliberate grace of a man whose body ached as a matter of course. His broad shoulders hunched against the wind as he nudged a stray calf back toward the main herd. He was counting. Again. He trusted his eyes more than the tally marks in any ledger. Each calf was a small, fragile promise of survival through the winter, a bulwark against the silent, creeping threat of failure that haunted every rancher in the territory. The windmill on the rise above the main house spun with a rhythmic, metallic squeal, a lonely metronome counting out the seconds until the first flakes fell. It was a sound so constant he only noticed it when it stopped. It was against this backdrop of gray sky and keening wind that the stagecoach appeared, a dark, lumbering shape, cresting the ridge on the rutted track that passed for a road. It was an unwelcome sight. Visitors were rare and usually meant trouble, a notice from the bank, a circuit judge with a new tax, or worse. Lane paused, his hand resting on the neck of his steady buckskin gelding, and watched the coach rattle its way closer, its wheels churning up clouds of dust that the wind immediately seized and scattered. It pulled to a halt near the turnoff to his ranch, a place no stage was scheduled to stop. A woman descended. From a distance, she was just a silhouette against the bleak landscape, but as she began the long walk toward him, details emerged. She was tall for a woman, with a straight-backed posture that spoke of resolve rather than refinement. She carried a single, scuffed leather valise that looked as weary as she did. Her dress was dark, practical, and dusted with the grime of a long journey. As she drew nearer, he saw her face. It was not beautiful in the way of the saloon girls in Sagebrush Ford, all paint and easy smiles. Hers was a face of quiet angles and shadows, dominated by large, intelligent eyes the color of moss after a rain. There were faint smudges of exhaustion beneath them. She looked to be around 28, a woman who had already seen her share of the world's sharp edges. She stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to spook the cattle. "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was clear, low, and carried easily on the wind, with none of the fragility he might have expected. "I'm Mercer." He clipped, his tone flat and unwelcoming. His gaze flickered from her face to the worn valise and back again. He did not dismount. "My name is Rosalind Pierce. I was told you might have need of temporary help." With the season turning, Lane's eyes narrowed. He needed help. That was true. His last hand had gotten spooked by the isolation and the long hours, quitting 2 weeks prior. But a woman, and one who appeared out of nowhere on a stagecoach. He had no use for a housekeeper. The dust in the main house could pile up to the rafters for all he cared. "What kind of help?" "I can cook, mend. I keep a clean ledger. I'm not afraid of hard work. Mr. Mercer." She met his suspicious stare without flinching. "I just need a place to winter, and I'll earn my keep." He considered her, the silence stretching out, punctuated only by the groan of the windmill and the lowing of a nervous calf. The main house was off limits. It had been since his wife, Martha, passed from fever 4 years ago. It was a museum of a life that was over, and he was its sole, silent curator. No one went in but him. "The men make their own coffee and fry their own bacon. I handle the books." He was about to send her on her way, to tell her to try her luck in town, when a gust of wind pressed her dress against her frame. She shivered, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, but he saw it. He saw the raw, chapped skin on her knuckles where she gripped the handle of her valise. He thought of the coming storm, of the endless frozen nights. His refusal died in his throat, replaced by a grudging sense of duty he despised. "There's a cot in the tack room," he said, his voice rough. "You'll make coffee for the riders at dawn and keep the tally as I call it out. You don't enter the main house, not for any reason. Your pay is board and 3 meals. When the spring thaw comes, you move on." It was a cold, hard offer, stripped of any kindness. He expected her to balk, to show a flash of pride or indignation. Instead, a wave of palpable relief washed over her features, softening the tension in her jaw. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. That's more than fair." He grunted, a sound of dismissal, and turned his horse, nudging the herd toward the relative shelter of the lower pasture. He didn't look back to see her pick up her valise and begin the walk toward the cluster of low-slung ranch buildings, her form stark and solitary against the vast, unforgiving land. Rosalind's corner of the tack room smelled of leather, sweat and saddle soap, an honest, earthy perfume that she found more comforting than the cheap lavender water she'd once known. The cot was narrow, the mattress stuffed with straw, but after weeks of sleeping, sitting up in coaches and waiting rooms, it felt like a luxury. She laid out her few belongings, 2 spare dresses, a brush, a small book of poetry with a cracked spine, and a bar of lye soap. That first night, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of the ranch. The wind howled around the eaves of the barn, a mournful, lonely sound. Below it, she could hear the herd, a constant, living presence. The cattle shifted and murmured, their soft rumbles and occasional snorts a tide of sound that ebbed and flowed, a restless, breathing sea. It was a sound of life, and it kept the deeper silence at bay. The talk in Sagebrush Ford, when Lane rode in for supplies a few days later, was of one thing: Duke Halvorson. Halvorson was a new kind of power in the territory, a man who didn't deal in cattle or gold, but in water. He was a baron of streams and rivers, buying up rights with a smile and a handshake that felt more like a threat. The latest rumor, thick and heavy as saloon smoke, was that he had his sights set on Cold Hare Creek, the artery that fed the entire high timber basin. To dam the Cold Hare would be to hold a knife to the throat of every rancher downstream, including Lane Mercer. The men in the general store fell silent when Lane walked in, their conversations trailing off into awkward coughs. They watched him from the corners of their eyes. He was Mercer, the loner, the man who had walled himself off after his brother, Caleb, fell. The accident had happened 5 years ago. They'd been building a new bridge over the ravine at Split Angel Cut, a shortcut that would save them a day's ride during cattle drives. Lane had been on the far bank, securing the main cable, when the central support beam, weakened by an unseen rot, had snapped. Caleb had been on the beam. He'd had a moment, a single, horrifying second to look across the chasm at his brother, his mouth open in a shout that was swallowed by the crack of splintering timber. Then he was gone. Lane had carried the guilt of it like a second skin ever since. He had been the one to choose the wood, to oversee the construction. In his mind, he had failed his brother, and that failure had curdled his trust in the world, and in himself. He hadn't worked with a partner since. He ran the ranch alone, with only a few hired riders who knew better than to ask personal questions. His suspicion of Rosalind Pierce, therefore, was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. It was a default setting. So when he walked into the tack room to grab a new lariat and saw her sitting on her cot, mending a tear in her dress by the light of a lantern, he barely registered it. But then the light caught something on the small crate she used as a table, a pocket compass, its brass casing gleaming, and a coiled surveyor's measuring tape. He stopped dead in the doorway. The tools of a mapmaker, the tools of someone who measured land, who defined boundaries, who assessed value, the tools of someone who might be sent to scout a territory before a man like Duke Halvorson made his move. The hum of suspicion roared into a siren. "Where did you get those?" he demanded, his voice hard as iron. Rosalind looked up. Startled, she followed his gaze to the compass and tape. "They were my husband's," she said quietly. "He was a surveyor. He taught me the trade before he passed." The explanation was simple, plausible, but Lane's trust was a barren field where nothing grew. He saw a spy, a Trojan horse sent to map his vulnerabilities, to chart the flow of his water and the strength of his fences. He said nothing more, just grabbed the lariat and stalked out, the door banging shut behind him, leaving her in the sudden, echoing silence. The storm held off, but a cold, steady drizzle began the next day, turning the corrals and pastures into a slick, treacherous mire. It was the kind of weather that made cattle stupid and men miserable. Late in the afternoon, a cry went up from one of the riders. A young calf, spooked by a slip of its mother on the muddy bank of a wash, had tumbled into a deep sinkhole, a thick pit of sucking, clay-like mud. By the time Lane got there, 2 riders were trying to get a rope around the terrified animal, but the slick, steep sides of the hole offered no purchase. The calf was sinking deeper, its desperate bawling growing weaker. "It's no good, boss," one of the men said, wiping mud from his face. "We can't get low enough without going in ourselves, and then we'll all be stuck." Lane was calculating the loss, his face grim, when Rosalind appeared at the edge of the hole. Before he could order her back, she had dropped to her belly. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, she slid headfirst into the sinkhole, the cold, thick mud instantly soaking through her dress and coating her arms and hair. She ignored the grasping sludge and worked her way down until she was beside the calf, speaking to it in a low, soothing voice. She took the rope from the stunned rider above and, with painstaking effort, worked it under the calf's belly and around its chest, her fingers sure and steady despite the cold. "I've got it," she called up, her voice strained. "Pull steady, not too fast." Lane took the rope himself. He felt the tension, the dead weight of the calf and the drag of the mud. "Heave!" he yelled to the other men. They pulled, their boots slipping in the muck. The rope went taut, and slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the calf began to rise from the mud's grip. As it came free, Rosalind tried to scramble back up the slick bank. Her hands shot out, searching for a hold, and scraped hard against a half-buried rock. A sharp, dark line of red bloomed on the back of her hand, a stark contrast to the gray-brown mud. She gasped in pain but kept climbing, finally hauling herself over the edge, shivering and covered head to toe in filth. She stood there, breathing heavily, and pushed a muddy strand of hair from her face, leaving a streak of grime across her cheek. She looked at the rescued calf, now being nudged by its mother, and then her gaze met Lane's. For a long, silent moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. He saw not a spy, but a woman of grit and substance, a woman who would throw herself into the mud to save a single, worthless calf. Something in the walled-off fortress of his heart shifted, a stone loosening in the foundation. He opened his mouth to say something, thank you, perhaps, or to ask about her hand, but the words wouldn't come. The habit of silence was too strong. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Sheriff Aldous Pike reined in his horse, his portly frame seeming to overflow the saddle. Pike was a man whose affability was as thin as cheap varnish, barely concealing the hard grain of Halverson's influence beneath. His eyes, small and shrewd, took in the scene: the muddy calf, the exhausted riders, and Rosalind, a shocking, mud-caked apparition, having some trouble. "Mercer?" Pike asked, a lazy smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze settled on Rosalind, lingering with pointed curiosity. "Didn't know you'd hired on new help, especially not such a dedicated hand." "We're managing," Lane said, his voice cold, stepping slightly to position himself between the sheriff and Rosalind. "Just making my rounds," Pike said, though he hadn't been seen on Mercer land in over a year. Heard tell there was a strange woman asking for work around the basin. A man can't be too careful these days. The insinuation hung in the damp air. "She's a tally keeper," Lane said, forcing the words out. "And a damn good coffee maker. That's all you need to know." Pike's smile widened. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more mockery than respect, and wheeled his horse around. "You see that you keep it that way, Mercer." He rode off. His broad back a clear and present warning. That night, the cold deepened. Rosalind cleaned the gash on her hand as best she could and wrapped it in a strip of clean cloth. The pain was a dull, rhythmic throb. She lay on her cot, listening to the wind, which now carried the unmistakable whisper of sleet. The ranch was quiet, the riders asleep in the bunkhouse. From the main house, 100 feet away, she could hear nothing, and yet she felt the presence of the man inside it, a solitary island of grief and suspicion. Later, drifting in the gray space between waking and sleep, a sound pulled her back, a voice from the main house, thick with sleep but sharp with old pain. It was Lane. Don't let the beam break," he mumbled, the words a raw, ragged plea lost to the uncaring night. "Caleb, hold on, don't let it break." Rosalind lay perfectly still in the darkness of the tack room. The wind rattled the door, and the sleet tapped against the roof like tiny, insistent fingers. She listened to the embers of a memory burning a man alive in his own home, and for the first time, she understood that the cold of the Montana winter was nothing compared to the chill radiating from the heart of the Mercer outfit. The drizzle gave way to a biting clarity. The moon, when it appeared between scudding clouds, was a silver dollar in a black velvet sky, casting sharp, cold shadows that seemed to have edges you could cut yourself on. Inside the small ranch office, a room Lane tolerated because it wasn't truly part of the main house. The air was stale with the scent of old paper and cooling coffee. A single lantern threw a pool of yellow light onto the ledger, its pages a dense forest of numbers. Lane sat hunched over the book, a pen clutched in his fist like a weapon. He worked slowly, his lips moving as he added the columns. His brow furrowed in concentration, the numbers blurred. He rubbed his eyes, the weariness of the long day settling deep into his bones. Rosalind stood in the doorway, a shadow among shadows. She had been watching him for several minutes. "I can help with that," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. He didn't look up. "I handle my own books." "You're tired. An extra set of eyes can prevent mistakes." She stepped into the light. The bandage on her hand was a stark white against her skin. "Let me read the columns. You can write them down." It was a small compromise, one that kept the pen and the ledger the symbols of his ownership and control in his hands. He hesitated, his pride warring with a fatigue so profound it felt like a physical weight. "Finally," he grunted, a sound of reluctant agreement. "Start with feed costs." She moved to stand on the other side of the desk, her presence filling the small space. She didn't lean or peer over his shoulder, but stood straight, her gaze fixed on the page. $72.40, she began, her voice a low, steady cadence. "Plus $116. She paused for only a breath. "Is $188.40, plus $65 for Salt Lick, $253.40. Lane's pen stopped scratching across the paper. He looked up, his eyes narrowed. He hadn't even finished adding the first two figures in his head. "Say that again." $253.40, she repeated calmly. "The next column is $97 for wire." He ignored her, his mind catching up. Quickly running the calculation himself, he stared at the number she'd given. She was right, exactly right. He looked at her, a flicker of something astonishment, grudging respect crossing his face before the mask of suspicion slammed back into place. "Just read the numbers. Pierce," he said, his voice rougher than before. I'll do the adding. But as she continued, he found himself listening to her totals, checking them against his own slower calculations. She was never wrong. The speed of her mind was an unsettling thing. Another piece of the puzzle of who she was that didn't fit the simple story of a destitute widow. It was a tool, and like her compass and measuring tape, he wondered who she had been trained to use it for. The news came 2 days later, carried by Joel Vickers, a young rider with an honest face and eyes that hadn't yet been hardened by the land. He'd ridden back from Sagebrush Ford, his horse lathered and his expression grim. He found Lane reshoeing his buckskin in the smithy. "Mr. Mercer," Joel said, his voice tight with urgency. "Word's all over town. Halverson's man was at the land office. He's making formal offers on water rights for the whole basin. $1 an acre." Lane didn't stop hammering, the rhythmic clang of steel on steel echoing in the sudden silence of the barn. $1 is an insult. That's not the half of it. Joel pressed on. "The word is, if you don't sell, he'll find other ways. They're saying anyone who holds out will be dry by spring. He's promising the town a new mill if he gets control of the cold hair. People are listening." The hammer fell silent. Lane placed it carefully on the anvil, his movements deliberate, controlled. He looked at the boy, his gaze as cold and hard as the iron he held. People are fools. He picked up the horse's hoof again, his face an unreadable mask. But Joel saw a muscle twitch in his jaw, a single, telltale sign of the fury simmering beneath. The threat was no longer a rumor whispered in saloons. It was a formal declaration of war, delivered on legal paper. You will sell, or you will thirst. That evening, Lane found her again. Not in the office, but outside, on the rise near the squealing windmill. The wind was picking up, cold and sharp from the north. She was kneeling on the ground, a large sheet of oiled paper spread out before her, held down with the rocks. In the fading light, he saw that she was sketching with a piece of charcoal, her strokes swift and certain. He walked closer, his boots silent on the packed earth. It was a map, not of his ranch, not of fences and corrals, but of the land itself. He saw the unmistakable curve of the high timber basin, the sharp gash of Split Angel Cut, and the winding, branching lifeblood of Cold Hare Creek and its smaller tributaries. She was mapping the watershed. She knew the contours of the land, the way the water flowed, its sources and its destinations. She knew its secrets. His blood ran cold. The image of her, mud-caked and brave, saving his calf, warred with this new, damning evidence. This was the work of a surveyor, a planner. This was the knowledge Halverson would need to choke the life out of the basin. "What is this?" he asked. The question was a shard of ice. She looked up, her expression open, unguarded. "I was just thinking," she said, gesturing to the drawing. "If a man wanted to dam the creek, the narrow bend up by the cottonwoods would be the place to do it. But the water table is high on the west bank. A dam there would flood the low meadows within a day. He'd have to divert it, not just stop it." She spoke with the calm authority of an expert, her mapmaker's mind seeing the problem in 3 dimensions. He stared at her, the intricate drawing a confession in his eyes. All he could see was a betrayal taking shape in charcoal on oiled paper. He didn't hear the strategic insight. He heard the reconnaissance report of an enemy scout. He turned without a word and walked away. The distance between them once again a chasm of mistrust. The poison spread quickly. In the Copper Lantern Saloon, a place that thrived on gossip and cheap whiskey, a new story took root. It was planted by a stranger with money for a round. A man no one had seen before, and no one would see again. The story was simple and devastating. Lane Mercer was cracking. He was in talks with Halverson. He was going to sell his water rights, save his own skin, and leave his neighbors high and dry. The rumor was a spark in dry grass, and it caught fire. Men who had known Lane for years began to look at him with suspicion. The isolation he had built around himself now became a cage. Proof of the conspiracy arrived by accident. Joel Vickers was in the bunkhouse, cleaning his gear, when a folded piece of paper fell from the inner pocket of his coat. He'd been given it in town by the postmaster, who'd asked him to pass it along to Sheriff Pike. It wasn't uncommon. Ranchers often carried mail for one another. But as Joel bent to pick it up, the paper unfolded. In the dim light, he saw the addressee Sheriff Aldous Pike, and in the corner, pressed into a handsome wax seal, was the unmistakable emblem of Duke Halverson's enterprise, a stylized H, entwined with a flowing river. Joel's heart hammered against his ribs. He folded the letter quickly, his hands trembling slightly, and shoved it deep into his pocket. He didn't need to read the contents to understand what he held. It was evidence of the secret alliance everyone suspected, but no one could prove. Lane found the sheriff riding the northern boundary of the ranch the next day, ostensibly checking for strays. Pike sat his horse with an air of smug authority, his badge glinting in the pale sun. "Pike," Lane said, reining in his buckskin. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Mercer," the sheriff replied, his smile thin. "Just keeping the peace." "I heard a rumor in town," Lane said, his eyes boring into the sheriff's, "that I'm selling out." Pike shrugged, a theatrical gesture of indifference. "Can't control what people say. A man in your position, losing your brother, trying to run this place alone. No one would blame you for taking the smart way out. And Halverson's way is the smart way. Halverson is the future. Mercer, you can't fight a river, and you can't fight progress." The sheriff's gaze hardened. "There's an official territorial cattle count starting next week. Be a shame if some of your herd went missing beforehand. A man can lose his whole operation over an inaccurate tally. I'd advise you to stay quiet and not cause any trouble." It was a threat, delivered with the full weight of the law behind it. Pike was telling him that the rules could be bent, that numbers could be changed, that his livelihood rested on the sheriff's goodwill that belonged entirely to Duke Halverson. Lane held the sheriff's gaze for a long moment, the air crackling with unspoken violence. Then, he pulled his horse's head around and rode away, the warning echoing in his ears. He was circling a small herd near the creek, his thoughts black, when he saw the movement. A man on foot, keeping to the shadows of the willows that lined the bank. He wasn't one of Lane's riders. Lane pulled his horse back into a thicket of brush, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He watched. The man was carrying a wooden mallet and a bundle of sharpened stakes, freshly cut and out of place among the weathered fence posts of the ranch. The man consulted a piece of paper, then hammered a stake into the ground, a good 10 yards inside Lane's property line, closer to the precious water of the creek. He was remarking the boundary, stealing the land and the water, one stake at a time. Lane's finger tightened on his rifle. It would be an easy shot, a problem solved. But as he raised the rifle, he saw another figure emerge from the direction of the ranch house. It was Roslyn. She carried a bucket, as if on her way to fetch water. But her path was too deliberate. She walked toward the creek, her eyes scanning the ground. Lane watched, his breath held tight in his chest, his suspicion a bitter taste in his mouth. Was she meeting the man? Was this the rendezvous? She reached the spot where the new stake had been driven. She stopped, glanced around, her movements casual. She saw no one. Then, with a quiet deliberation that stunned him, she put down her bucket, bent over, and worked the new stake out of the ground. She looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the deep grass where it would never be found. She paced off the distance to the old, sun-bleached boundary marker, its wood gray and gnarled with age. She took a large, flat rock and set it firmly on the spot where the new stake had been, an anonymous, natural-looking camouflage. Then she picked up her bucket and continued to the creek. Lane lowered the rifle, his mind reeling. He had just witnessed a quiet, profound act of loyalty. She had risked herself, silently undoing the enemy's work. She wasn't a spy. She was a fighter. He watched her fill the bucket and walk back toward the house, her back straight, her stride even. He understood in that moment that he had been wrong about her, completely and utterly wrong. The realization did not bring him relief. It brought a complex, unfamiliar shame. He should ride out, tell her he had seen, offer her his thanks. But the words were locked behind years of self-imposed silence. He remained hidden in the brush, the unspoken gratitude a heavy stone in his gut, and watched her go. That night, the north wind arrived in force. It was a dry, cold gale that shrieked through the basin, rattling windows and whipping the last of the dead leaves from the cottonwoods. The cattle felt it. They wouldn't settle. They milled about in the holding pastures, their heads up, their bawling a constant. Nervous complaint on the wind, the sound of a night owl's hoot, usually a comforting, familiar call, now sounded like a strange whistle in the dark, sending ripples of panic through the herd. Lane and his riders were out with them, trying to keep them calm, their voices lost in the gale. It was a losing battle. The air was charged with the threat of a stampede. Amidst the chaos, Lane noticed a new sound threading through the wind and the panicked lowing. It was a whistle, but not a human one. It was a soft, melodic, three-note call, repeated over and over. It was Roslyn. She was walking the fence line, her small form barely visible in the moonlight, and whistling. It wasn't a drover's call, nothing he had ever heard before. It was a simple, soothing tune, almost a lullaby, and it was working. The cattle nearest her were turning their heads, their nervous shifting easing, their bawling softening to low murmurs. She was calming them with a sound. He rode over to her, the wind tearing at his hat. "What are you doing?" he yelled over the noise. "My father used to say that a new sound can break an old fear," she shouted back, never stopping her strange, gentle whistle. "They're afraid of the owl's call. I'm just giving them something different to listen to." He watched her for another moment, saw the undeniable effect she was having. His own shouted commands were only making the cattle more agitated, but her quiet persistence was a balm. It was a wisdom that came not from experience on a ranch, but from somewhere else, some other life. It was hers, and it was effective. A grudging admission formed in his mind. He couldn't bring himself to praise her. Not yet, but he couldn't deny what he was seeing. He turned his horse to ride back to the center of the herd. "Just do as I do," he called out, his voice rough and clipped, nearly snatched away by the wind. "Keep them moving, keep them together." It wasn't thanks. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was an instruction, an inclusion. It was the first time he had treated her not as an outsider to be watched, but as a hand to be directed. In the howling darkness, under the cold silver moon, it was a start. The camp at Lark Mesa was not a camp at all. It was an island of firelight in an ocean of high plains darkness. The mesa was flat, exposed, and scoured by a wind that had traveled 1,000 miles with nothing to stop it. Lane had chosen it because the shallow depression offered some protection, and the spring-fed pool nearby was the last reliable water before the snows locked the high country. The cattle, more than 800 head, were bunched in a vast, living crescent, their backs to the wind, their collective warmth creating a steamy haze that rose in the frigid air. They were restless, their soft, anxious lowing a constant, deep vibration underfoot. The fire, built in a ring of heavy stones, was the camp's magnetic north, the single point of warmth and light. Lane handed Roslyn a tin mug of coffee, black and strong enough to float a horseshoe. "You'll take the first watch," he said. It wasn't a question. "With me, the herd's spooked by the wind. They'll need 2 sets of eyes." She nodded, her hands wrapping around the hot tin, grateful for the searing heat. She had expected to be sent to the supply wagon with the other riders who were off duty, to huddle in her thin bedroll. This assignment felt different. It was a test, but it was also, in its way, a kind of inclusion. They sat on the leeward side of the fire, their backs to a large boulder that cut some of the wind. Lane took a seat on his own saddle, a throne of worn leather. Rosalind settled onto a smaller, flat-topped rock nearby, pulling her coat tight. The fire lit their faces in flickering shades of orange and red. But the night beyond the small circle of light was absolute. The cold was a physical thing, a heavy presence that seeped through the soles of her boots and the wool of her coat. She shivered, a deep, bone-rattling tremor she couldn't control. She pressed her lips together to keep her teeth from chattering. Lane watched her from the corner of his eye. He saw the tremor, the way she hunched her shoulders to make herself smaller against the cold. He looked away, his expression grim. He had a deep, primal distrust of weakness, yet the sight of her shivering in the dark, her hands raw, her face pale, stirred something in him he'd long thought dead. It was an echo of the same protective urge he'd felt when his brother was young, an urge he had buried on the day of the bridge collapse. With a grunt, he stood, unlashed his heavy wool bedroll, and shook it out. It was a thick, heavy thing, smelling of canvas, wool, and the faint, clean scent of sage. He didn't offer it. He simply spread it out on the ground between his saddle and her rock, then sat on one edge. He motioned with his head. "Sit on the bedroll. The rock's drawing the heat from you." She hesitated. Her pride stung. "I'm fine, Mr. Mercer." "Don't be a fool," he said, his voice flat, not unkind, but impatient with ceremony. "Sit down. We've got 4 hours of this." She moved, sliding from the rock onto the edge of the thick blanket. It was immediately, shockingly warmer, the wool insulating her from the frozen earth, but the air was still a knife. Lane, sitting a respectable 2 feet away, unfolded the other half of the heavy blanket. "We share it," he stated, as if discussing a ration of bacon. "It's the only sensible thing. We'll hold the heat between us." He draped the heavy top layer over his own lap, then, with an impersonal efficiency, flipped the remainder over her knees and shoulders. The blanket was a shared roof, a small, private tent against the vast, cold night. They sat in silence, 2 separate people under one covering. But the wind was relentless. It found the gap between them, a cold snake that slithered in and touched their skin. Instinctively, they both shifted, hunching deeper, moving closer to the fire. And then it happened. Their backs, layered in canvas and wool, brushed. It was a small contact, but the effect was electric. Both of them went rigid. Rosalind's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time she had felt the simple, uncomplicated warmth of another human being in over a year. It was startling, a sudden reminder of a life she had forgotten. Lane's reaction was just as profound. His muscles tensed, his first instinct to pull away, to reestablish the barrier of space that was his only real defense. He felt the slightness of her, the rigid line of her spine against his. It was an intrusion, a violation of the isolation he so carefully curated. But the cold was a greater truth. To pull away would be to invite the freezing wind back in. To pull away would be an act of cruelty, both to her and to himself. So, after a long, taut second that stretched into a minute, they both relaxed, just slightly. They didn't lean into each other. They simply let it be. They accepted the shared warmth as a necessity of survival, a truce brokered by the hostile night. The fire crackled. The wind moaned over the top of the mesa. The cattle shifted, their hooves a soft, heavy shuffling. The silence between them, now filled with this new, fragile awareness, grew heavy. It was Rosalind who broke it, her voice quiet, aimed at the fire. "My husband died of lung fever." Lane didn't move. He gave no sign he had heard, other than the fact that he didn't stop her. He continued to stare into the darkness beyond the herd, his eyes scanning for movement. "It was in a boarding house in St. Joseph," she continued, her voice a monotone, a simple recitation of facts. "We hadn't even crossed the Missouri yet. He was a surveyor. He had paper dreams of mapping new territories, of laying out towns that didn't exist. She paused, watching a log crumble into a cascade of orange sparks. It was an arranged marriage. My family in Ohio, his in Pennsylvania. It was a joining of properties. Not people. I barely knew him. She let out a small, dry breath that was almost a laugh. He was not a strong man. The journey, the damp, the sheer vastness of it all. It terrified him. The fever was just the final thing. He was gone in 3 days. I was left with his name, a valise full of clothes that didn't fit anyone, and his tools. She turned her head slightly, looking at his profile in the firelight. I wasn't grieving a husband. I was grieving the idea of what was supposed to come next. I was just stranded. Lane remained silent for a long time. He processed her story. He heard the emptiness in it, the profound, hollow loneliness that was so different from his own sharp-edged grief. His grief was a wound, a trauma. Hers was an absence, a void. He had no words of comfort. Sorry was a useless, soft word, and he didn't trade in them. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his saddlebag, which lay beside him. His hand emerged holding a small, worn leather pouch, dark with age and tied with a rawhide thong. He didn't look at her. He just held it out. She looked at his hand, confused. What is it? Take it. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough as rock, but there was a surprising warmth to it. She took the small pouch. It was heavy and warm from being near his body. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers numb. He saw her struggle and, with an impatient sigh, took it back, undid the knot with a single pull, and poured a few dark, glossy beans into her palm. Coffee beans, deeply roasted, almost black. Put them in your pocket, he grunted. Hold on to them. They'll hold the warmth from the fire longer than your gloves. She looked at the beans, then at him. It was the strangest, most practical, and most deeply kind gesture she had ever received. She closed her hand around the small, hard beans, feeling their stored heat. She slipped them into her coat pocket, her fingers curling around them. A tiny, secret furnace. The wind rose again, a sudden, violent gust that swept across the camp, lifting a cloud of hot ash and sparks from the fire. The embers swirled around them, stinging their faces. Rosalind turned away, coughing, and the cold found her again, hitting her full in the chest. She shivered, this time uncontrollably. Her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the wind. When it's cold like this, when the world is this big and this empty, it makes you realize. She looked at the huddled, breathing mass of the herd. People, we just need a heartbeat nearby, something to prove we're not the only living thing left. The simple, unadorned truth of her words struck him. A heartbeat nearby. It was what he had lost. It was what he had denied himself for 5 years. He turned, his body moving before his mind could object. He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer an embrace. He simply shifted his weight, moving his broad back and shoulder to place himself more fully between her and the relentless wind. It was a conscious act of sheltering. He became a wall, a physical barrier. His shoulder was a foot from hers. His hand rested on his own knee, but his very presence now blocked the worst of the cold from her. It was a courtesy, a kindness with a hard, defined border. A shadow darted at the very edge of the firelight. A red fox, its fur magnificent in the glow, its eyes like 2 green embers. It was bold, made desperate by the coming winter. It sniffed at a scrap of bacon fat dropped by one of the riders. The cattle smelled it. A nervous ripple went through the herd. A steer snorted, tossing its head, and the panic was contagious. The lowing grew louder, more anxious. "Get!" Rosalind said, her voice sharp. She scrambled to her feet, wanting to scare it off before it triggered a real panic. Stiff from the cold, her legs cramped, her foot caught on the rumpled edge of the bedroll. She stumbled, her balance gone, and pitched forward, a small cry escaping her as she fell directly toward the glowing bed of coals. Lane moved like a cat, in one fluid motion. He was off the saddle and on his feet, his arms shooting out. He caught her hard around the waist, pulling her back from the fire with a jerk that snapped her head back. She fell against his chest, her hands flying up to brace against his solid, unyielding coat. The world stopped. For 1, 2, 3 seconds, they stood locked together. He could feel the frantic, bird-like hammering of her heart against his ribs. Or perhaps it was his own. His arm was a band of steel around her, his hand splayed on her back. He was inundated with the scent of her not perfume, but the clean, cold smell of the night air in her hair, the smell of wood smoke, and the faint, sweet aroma of the coffee beans from her pocket. She gasped, breathing him in damp wool, leather, and the primal, male scent of him, clean sweat and strength. He held her for just that moment, long enough to feel her weight, to know she was safe, to register the alien, shocking softness of her body against his. Then, just as quickly, he set her back on her feet, his hands releasing her as if she were hot to the touch. He stepped back, putting a yard of cold air between them, his face an unreadable mask in the shadows. "Careful," he rasped, his voice rougher than usual. The cattle were not careful. The sudden movement, the cry, the scent of the fox, it was too much. The herd began to surge, a wave of horn and hide, their lowing turning to bellows of fear. "Easy," Lane said, his voice dropping, changing. He didn't shout. He turned his back on Roslyn, facing the sea of panicked animals. "Easy, now, ho, now, easy." He began to sing. It was not a song for people. It was a rubo, a cattle lullaby, a sound as old as the hills themselves. His voice was a low, rough baritone, like gravel rolling in a slow creek. There were no real words, just a repetitive, mesmerizing chant. "Hoo-oo, now, ho-oh-oh cattle, sleep now, easy, ho-oh-oh." It was the sound a man used to soothe great, simple-minded beasts, a sound that spoke of safety, of night, of rest. It was a sound that was meant to be a fence in the darkness. He sang it to the herd, but he was also singing it to the wind, to the night, and to the raw, jangled nerves of the two people by the fire. Roslyn stood frozen, watching him. She watched his shoulders relax, watched him pour his own calm into the air through his voice. The song was unbearably sad and infinitely comforting, a sound made to soothe pain. The cattle heard it. The rising tide of panic hesitated. Heads turned. The bawling softened, subsided, returning to the low, restless murmuring from before. He kept singing for several minutes, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the chaotic night. When he finally stopped, the silence that returned was different. It was softer, less empty. He sat back down on his saddle, but he didn't motion for her to sit on the bedroll. He simply nodded toward it, giving her the choice. She sat, pulling her half of the blanket over her. They didn't resume their back-to-back position. They sat side by side, a careful foot of space between them, both facing the fire. The fire had burned down to a deep, pulsing bed of embers. The light was no longer flickering. It was a steady, warm, ruby glow. Lane looked at Roslyn. The red light caught in her eyes, turning them into deep, liquid pools that held two tiny, reflected flames. She was watching him, her gaze direct, stripped of all artifice. She was simply seeing him, and in her eyes, he saw his own reflection, a man bathed in the color of embers. He felt exposed, as if she could see the old, banked fires of his own grief. It was too much. Roslyn saw the look on his face, the sudden vulnerability, the tightening of his jaw as he fought it. She saw the man who had lost his brother, the man who sang to his cattle in the dark. It was a profound, dangerous intimacy. She looked away first, her gaze dropping to the coals. her own defenses sliding back into place. The rest of the watch passed in this new, charged silence, when the sky had just begun to pale in the east, the gray promise of a false dawn. They heard the crunch of boots. It was Joel Vickers, come to relieve them. Lane stood, his body stiff. He rolled up the bedroll with practiced, economical movements. My watch is done. Joel will spell you for the last hour before sunrise. She nodded, handing him back his half of the blanket, her fingers clumsy with cold. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. He slung the bedroll over his shoulder, then paused. He stood for a moment, his back to her, a tall, dark shape against the dying fire. He wanted to say something, but the words were foreign. He had seen her strength. He had shared her past. He had felt her heartbeat. He settled for the only thing he could. He turned his head slightly. Sleep now, Pierce. It was the first time he had used her name. Not girl, not woman, not you. Pierce. It was a solid thing. A name. It was an acknowledgement. It landed in the cold air with the weight of a stone. Rosalind watched him walk away, his shadow stretching long in the pre-dawn light, and she clutched the small, warm coffee beans in her pocket. The silence that followed the night on Lark Mesa was not comfortable. It was charged, heavy with the things that had been shared, the warmth, the fear, the low, rumbling song in the darkness. When Lane spoke to Rosalind, his voice was clipped again, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but the wall of his suspicion had a visible crack. He had seen her grit, and he had heard her past. Now, he found himself listening to her mind. They were in the cold, cramped office, the ledger book open between them. The numbers were no longer the enemy, but the land they represented was. He won't stop, Lane said, staring at the map she had drawn of the watershed. He was no longer looking at it as a spy's report, but as a battlefield schematic. Pike's threat about the cattle count is one thing. Halverson's play for the creek is another. He's trying to erase the boundary, Rosalind said, her finger tracing the blue line of the cold hair. He has Pike claiming the old markers are lost. If there are no recognized markers, the boundaries are in dispute. If they are in dispute, he can file a new claim, backed by the sheriff, and choke the water before a circuit judge ever sees the paperwork. The boundaries are the boundaries, Lane said, his voice a low growl. My father and his father ranched this land. But they ranched by handshake, she countered, her tone sharp with technical precision. The law doesn't care about handshakes. It cares about proof. We need to stop fighting him with fences and start fighting him with the law. She looked up, her gaze meeting his. You have the original deed, the territorial grant. In the house, he said, the words stiff. He went into the forbidden main house, the air thick with dust and the scent of time, and returned with a tin box. She opened it carefully. Inside, protected by oiled cloth, were the founding documents of the Mercer outfit. She unfurled a heavy, creased document. Her eyes scanned the dense, iron gall script. She stopped, her finger pressing flat. Here, Sagebrush Water Charter, 1876. It's not just a deed, Lane. It's a compact. I know the charter, he said impatiently. It just says the creek is shared. It says more than that, she said, a spark lighting her eyes. It says the boundaries are coterminous with the mean high water mark of the creek as surveyed in the year of our Lord, 1876. He thinks the markers are gone, but the creek is the marker. We don't need to find the old stakes. We need to prove where the 1876 high water mark is. We need to resurvey it. The plan was audacious. It was a direct, legal challenge to Halverson's land grab. It required precision, and it required them to work in the open, exposing themselves on the very land that was in dispute. Joel, Lane commanded, finding the young rider. You're with us. Bring the heavy mallet, the wagon, and the stakes from the carpenter's shed. To Rosalind, he said. What else? "Your longest steel wire, or a chain if you have one," she said, her mind already at work. "And paint, something bright." They worked for 2 days. It was a strange, intimate labor. A silent choreography of 3. Rosalind was the mind, Lane the muscle, and Joel the willing. Hurrying apprentice. Rosalind, with her husband's compass and a simple leveling sight, established a baseline. Then, the real work began. Hold the chain end at the witness pin. Joel, pull it taut. Lane, taut. Lane, his muscles straining, held the surveyor's chain 100 feet of heavy steel links stretched tight over the uneven ground. The metal bit into his palms. Rosalind peered through her sight, motioning him left or right, her voice clear and impersonal. Stake, she would call. Joel would run forward with a rough-hewn wooden stake, its tip sharpened, its top painted a brilliant, glaring red. Lane would take the heavy mallet and drive it into the hard, cold earth with 3 perfect, brutal blows. Thud, thud, thud. Each strike was a note of defiance. They were not building a fence. They were creating a line of evidence. They measured, staked, and measured again, leapfrogging the chain along the complex, winding contour of the creek bank. Joel moved with them, a ledger book tucked under his arm, meticulously writing down every bearing, every distance, every number Rosalind called out. Station 4, offset 22 feet, angle 89 degrees, stake set. Got it, Miss Pierce. Lane watched her. She was transformed. The weary widow was gone, replaced by a confident professional. She moved with purpose, her eyes sure, her calculations swift. She was mapping their defense. And he was, for the first time since his brother's death, trusting someone else to mark the line. On the 3rd morning, the interruption they had been dreading finally came. Sheriff Aldous Pike rode up. Not alone. He had 3 deputies with him, rough men with hard eyes who looked more like hired guns than lawmen. Pike's face was a mask of genial, false authority. "Well now, Mercer," Pike boomed, swinging down from his saddle. "That's a powerful lot of firewood you're planting." He walked over to the nearest red stake and gave it a kick. It didn't budge. Lane had driven it deep. Pike scowled, grabbed the stake with both hands, and wrenched it, grunting from the ground. He tossed it aside. "This is undeeded territory. Mercer, the original survey markers are lost. You can't just come out here and claim land that ain't yours." His deputies fanned out, starting to pull up the other stakes. Joel looked to Lane, his face pale, his hands clenched. Lane did not move. He held the heavy mallet in his hand, its weight familiar and comforting, but he made no motion toward his gun. He just watched Pike, his expression cold. "We're not claiming. Sheriff, we're marking, based on the 1876 charter. You're welcome to read it. It's in the office." Pike laughed, a short, barking sound. "The charter, that relic, it's a piece of paper. Mercer, this," he said, gesturing to his men, "is the law." "The charter is a binding legal document," Rosalind said, stepping forward. She was not intimidated. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind with the clarity of glass. Article 4, Section 2. It defines all riparian rights as extending to the established mean high water mark of the year of signage, 1876, regardless of subsequent erosion or channel deviation. Pike stared at her. His deputies, who had been yanking up stakes, paused, confused by the barrage of legal words. What nonsense is that?" "It's not nonsense, Sheriff," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "It means the boundary is not a lost stake. The boundary is the high water mark. We are simply locating it, as is our right. What you are doing is destroying legal survey markers, which is a territorial offense." Pike's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He was a man of threats and fists. He was lost in a fight of paragraphs and sections. He was about to retort. to order his men to arrest them, when a new sound joined the confrontation. It was the smooth, expensive sound of oiled axles and high-stepping horses. A black carriage, polished to a mirror shine, rolled to a stop on the rise above them. The door opened, and Duke Halverson emerged. He was the opposite of the land. Where the basin was rough, he was smooth. He wore a black wool suit, a silk vest, and a fine beaver hat. Not a speck of dust marred his polished boots. He was smiling, a thin, pleasant expression that did not touch his cold, pale blue eyes. "Sheriff Pike," he called, his voice rich and cordial. "What seems to be the trouble, surely, mister? Mercer isn't causing a disturbance on his own land." He descended the rise, walking with the unhurried grace of a man who owned every piece of ground he stood on. "Mr. Halverson, sir," Pike stammered, his belligerence vanishing, replaced by a fawning deference. "Mercer and this woman, they're driving stakes, claiming land." "Ah," Halverson said, as if noticing the red stakes for the first time. He looked at Roslyn, his smile appreciating her. A surveyor, how resourceful. He turned his full attention to Lane. "Mr. Mercer, I see I have underestimated your resolve. I admire that. Stubbornness is a virtue in this country. Up to a point." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a long leather wallet. "I came to make a final, neighborly offer. My associates in Helena are prepared to offer you $5 an acre. For the land, the cattle, the brand, cash. Today." He gestured to the muddy, cold creek. "That's more than this land will be worth in 6 months." "It's not for sale," Lane said. The words were quiet, final. Halverson's smile did not waver. He nodded, as if Lane had confirmed a private calculation. "A pity." He looked up at the sky, which was heavy and gray, then at the half-frozen mud of the creek bed. "I've been studying the old maps of this basin. Fascinating topography. The Cold Hare is a violent creek. Isn't it prone to rearrangement?" He looked directly at Lane, his voice still pleasant, still conversational. "These early thaws can be treacherous. An ice jam up in the Narrows, a sudden spring flood. This entire channel could shift 50 yards overnight. All your new red stakes would be left pointing at a dry arroyo." He paused, letting the image sink in. "And your charter would be worthless. Good day, Mr. Mercer, ma'am." He tipped his hat, climbed back into his black carriage, and was gone, leaving a silence that was heavier and colder than the air. The threat was perfect. He wasn't going to steal the land. He was going to move the creek. Pike, emboldened by his master's presence, sneered. "You heard the man. Pull these sticks, now." "Leave them," Lane said to Joel, who was holding a stake in his hand, his knuckles white. Lane turned and walked back toward the ranch house. Roslyn followed, her face pale, but her expression set and determined. They had lost the stakes. The open fight was over. The secret one was about to begin. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Roslyn and Joel slipped back to the creek. "He can't move the creek yet," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold. "But he can tamper with the flow. We need to prove what the water level is now, before he does." She had found a thick, square post of cured oak. She had painted it white, with precise, black, 1-inch markings. It was a water gauge. They waded into the freezing, thigh-deep water and, using a sledge, Lane had quietly driven it deep into the creek bed in a sheltered, hidden spot, back on the bank, concealed by a cluster of willows. Joel hammered in a smaller sign, a simple board on which he had written in heavy, waterproof ink water level gauge, October 31st, 1888. "It's proof," Roslyn whispered. "A dated record of the water level." The next morning, she went to check it before dawn. She returned to the bunkhouse as the men were gathering for coffee, her face a mask of controlled fury. Lane saw her expression and moved to meet her by the door. "It's gone," she said, her voice a low, shaking whisper. "Not just pulled out, it was hacked to pieces, smashed with an axe or a sledge. The sign, too, splintered." Lane's jaw tightened until a white line appeared. "Who?" "I don't know." She scanned the room. The riders were talking, laughing, unaware. Except one, Eddie Quayle. A surly hand who had hired on 2 weeks prior was sitting alone, gulping his coffee. He had washed his face and hands, but as he raised his mug, Rosalind saw it, there, under his left thumbnail, and smeared deep into the calluses of his palm, was a black, greasy stain. It was the waterproof ink from the signboard. She looked at Lane. Her eyes flicked to Quayle, then back to Lane. She said nothing, but her gaze was a confirmation. Lane did not hesitate. He did not ask for proof. He trusted her. He walked into the center of the room. The laughter died. "Quayle." The man looked up, startled. "Yeah, boss?" "Get your gear. Get your horse. You're done." Eddie Quayle stood up, his face darkening. "What, you can't fire me? I ain't done nothing." "You're done," Lane repeated, his voice flat as a razor. "Get out." "Now, hold on, Mercer," a familiar, oily voice said from the doorway. Sheriff Pike stood there, backlit by the gray morning light. He had been waiting, as if summoned. "You can't just throw a man off your property without cause. Eddie here is a good, dependable hand." The air in the bunkhouse became so thick it was hard to breathe. Eddie Quayle smiled. A small, triumphant sneer. He was protected. Lane looked at Pike. He saw the badge, the smugness, the corruption. He saw Halverson's trap. If he challenged Pike, he would be arrested. If he fought, he would be shot, and Halverson would win. Lane's right hand, which had been resting on his hip, dropped slowly, his fingers brushing the worn wooden grip of his Colt. Pike's hand mirrored the motion, his thumb hooking over his own gun belt. "I said, he's a dependable hand. Mercer, I'm telling you, he stays." The seconds ticked by. Joel Vickers held his breath, his eyes wide with terror. Rosalind watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, understanding that this was a confrontation Lane could not win. Lane held Pike's gaze. He saw the sheriff's finger tighten, saw the man's eagerness. Pike wanted him to draw, and in that instant, Lane's fury cooled into a glacial resolve. He would not give them the satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, Lane lifted his hand away from his gun. He raised it, pointing a finger not at Pike, but at Quayle. "He's fired," he said, his voice low and shaking with controlled rage. "And he's off my land. Now, escort your dependable hand to the property line. Sheriff, that's your job. Isn't it keeping the peace?" Pike's face fell. His victory soured. He had been denied his violence. He jerked his head at Quayle. "Get your damn horse!" He followed the man out, his shoulders stiff with anger. The bunkhouse was silent. Lane had backed down, but everyone in the room knew who had truly won the exchange. That night, Rosalind sat at the office desk, a clean sheet of paper in front of her. "Pike is the law in Sagebrush," she said, dipping the pen in the inkwell. "And Halverson is Pike. We have to go over his head." "There's Judge Hartley," Lane said, standing by the window, staring out into the blackness. "The circuit judge. He's in Helena. He's a hard man, but he's fair. He knew my father." "Then he's the one I'll write to," she said. Her hand was steady. She did not write a plea for help. She wrote a report. She detailed the legal basis of their claim under the 1876 Charter. She described the systematic removal of survey stakes, the intimidation by a compromised local sheriff, and the deliberate, timed destruction of dated evidence. It was a precise, cold, and undeniable accusation. She finished, signing her name with a clean, strong flourish. "The stage is too slow," Lane said. Pike watches the post. He turned and opened the door. "Joel." The young rider appeared, his face anxious. "Saddle the chestnut mare," Lane ordered. "She's the fastest. Ride to Three Forks, not Sagebrush. Go to the telegraph office. Send this by express post. Don't stop, and God help you. Don't let Pike or his men see you." Joel took the letter, his young face set with the gravity of the mission. He nodded once, a soldier accepting his orders, and disappeared into the night. Roslyn and Lane were left alone in the small pool of lamplight. The silence of the ranch heavy around them, their hope now riding a lone horse through the darkness. The night was a tinderbox. The air was dry, sucked clean of moisture by the relentless north wind, and carried the electric scent of ozone. The storm that Halverson had predicted had not yet brought rain, only a nervous, crackling energy that set the horses to stamping and the cattle to lowing. It came not as a boom, but as a silent, blinding flash. A bolt of dry lightning, jagged and violet white, struck the ridge behind the main herd. It was a freak of nature, a one-in-a-million shot, the brittle, sun-cured sagebrush and foxtail grass, parched for weeks, erupted in an instantaneous whoosh of orange flame. A wall of fire, not 10 feet high but 100 yards wide, bloomed in the darkness. The herd, already on a knife's edge of panic, exploded before the first terrified bellow had fully registered. Another sound ripped through the night, this one human. A series of high, piercing shrieks, not of fear, but of malicious intent. Someone was out there, hidden by the smoke and chaos, using the fire as a catalyst, deliberately driving the herd from panic into a full-blown stampede. The ground began to tremble, a low, deep thrum that grew into a deafening roar. It was the sound of 3,000 hooves striking the earth like hammers, the sound of a living avalanche, a river of horn and bone and blind terror. "Stampede!" The cry went up from the bunkhouse, a ragged shout of alarm. Lane was out of the office before the word was finished, pulling on his boots as he ran. He didn't need to give orders. His riders, seasoned men, knew the drill. They were already sprinting for the corral, for saddles and bridles, their movements frantic but efficient in the demonic, flickering light of the spreading brush fire. He saw Roslyn, a silhouette against the flames, her face pale with shock. "Stay in the house," he roared at her over the thunder of the hooves. "Lock the door." He didn't wait for a reply. He swung onto his buckskin, already saddled, and spurred the horse into a dead run, heading not away from the stampede, but directly toward its flank, a tiny, desperate boat aiming for the side of a tidal wave. The goal was not to stop them, that was impossible. The goal was to turn them, to get to the head of the herd, to force the lead steers into a mill, a vast circling pattern that would eventually exhaust their panic and bring the herd to a halt. If they couldn't be turned, they would run until they dropped, or worse, until they reached the sheer, 100-foot drop of Split Angel Cut, a chasm that had already claimed his brother. He saw Joel Vickers riding hard, a bundle of pitch-soaked torches slung over his shoulder. Lane pointed toward the front of the herd. "The head, turn the head," he yelled, his voice raw. Then, out of the chaos, another rider galloped past him, a slim figure on the fast chestnut mare. It was Roslyn. "Get back!" he bellowed, his voice filled with a fury born of terror for her safety. She didn't even look at him. She rode with a grace and a desperate courage that stole his breath, her body low over the horse's neck, her hair flying behind her like a dark banner. She was angling, like him, for the front of the herd. He saw then that she was not a liability. She was a part of the fight. There was no time to argue. He spurred his horse harder, the two of them riding parallel to the surging, unstoppable mass. They reached the churning, chaotic front of the stampede. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and hot dust. The noise was a physical blow, a continuous, deafening roar of hooves and panicked bellows. Lane leaned over, his face close to his horse's ear, and began to sing the low, guttural cattle lullaby, the rubo. It was a ridiculous, hopeless act, a whisper against a hurricane. But it was the only tool he had. Roslyn, riding beside him, heard the sound and, without hesitation, joined in. Her clear, steady whistle, the strange three-note call she had used before, cut through the bass roar of the herd. It was a tiny, piercing note of calm in a symphony of terror. Joel reached the front line and lit his first torch. He galloped ahead of the lead steers and threw the flaming brand to the ground. It flared up, a sudden, alien flower of fire. The led steer, its eyes white with terror, shied away from the flame, turning slightly. Joel threw another and another, creating a terrifying, flickering line that the herd would not cross. They were turning, slowly, grudgingly. The massive river of cattle began to bend. But one, a huge, powerful longhorn steer, maddened beyond reason, broke through. It smashed through a section of old rail fence with a sound of splintering timber and charged on, its path now leading directly toward the black, empty space that was Split Angel Cut. "No!" Lane yelled, wheeling his horse after it. Roslyn was right behind him. The steer was fast, its panic giving it an unnatural speed. It reached the cliff edge, its hooves skidding on the loose rock, and tried to stop, but its momentum was too great. It slid, bellowing, over the edge, disappearing from sight. Lane and Roslyn reined in their horses at the very brink of the chasm, their animals snorting and wild-eyed. Lane leaped from the saddle. He peered down into the darkness. It wasn't a clean drop. A narrow, muddy ledge, barely 5 feet wide, jutted out about 15 feet below. The steer was there, alive. One of its legs bent at an unnatural angle, its horns tangled in a thicket of tough, gnarled roots. It was trapped, terrified, and bleeding. "He'll die there," Lane said, his voice flat with defeat. "Or he'll panic again and fall the rest of the way." "We can't just leave him," Roslyn said, dismounting beside him. "I can't get down there," Lane said, shaking his head. "The ledge won't hold my weight, and the rock face is too sheer." He was already calculating the loss, turning away from the problem, his face a hard mask. "I can," she said. He turned and stared at her as if she were mad. "Don't be a fool. You'll be killed." "I'm lighter than you," she insisted, her voice urgent, her eyes blazing with an intensity he had never seen before. "If you can anchor a rope, I can get down there. I can get a second line around his horns. You and Joel can pull him up." It was an insane plan, a suicidal plan. But he looked at her face, at the set of her jaw, and he saw the same unyielding grit he had seen when she'd slid into the sinkhole of mud. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was going to do it, with or without his help. The thought of her trying it alone was unbearable. "Joel," he roared, "bring the lariats, all of them." They worked with a desperate, silent speed. Lane knotted 3 long, thick lariats together, testing each knot until his knuckles were white. He looped one end around the solid base of a gnarled juniper tree a few feet from the edge. The other end he tied around Roslyn's waist, his hands moving with a rough, impersonal efficiency, though his fingers trembled slightly. "I will hold this line," he said, his voice a low, fierce command. He took the main rope in his bare hands, bracing his feet against the tree's roots. "You signal me by tugging twice." "Understood." She nodded, her face pale in the moonlight, but her eyes were clear. Joel stood beside her, holding the second rope, the one she would have to secure to the steer. "Be careful, Miss Pierce," the boy whispered, his voice thick with awe and fear. She gave him a quick, tight smile, and then, without looking back, she turned and began to back over the edge of the cliff. The world became the rope for Lane. It was a living thing in his hands, a conduit through which he could feel her every move, her every hesitation. He played it out slowly, the rough hemp scraping his palms, his muscles bunching and straining as he took her full weight. He could hear the scrape of her boots on the rock face, the rain of dislodged pebbles falling into the darkness below. For Rosalind, the world was a dizzying, terrifying vertical plane. The wind whistled in her ears. The steer below her thrashed, its bellows echoing up the cliff face. Her feet scrabbled for purchase on the slick, muddy rock. The rope around her waist was a reassuring, painful pressure. She trusted Lane. She trusted the solid, unmoving strength of the man at the other end of the line. She had to. She reached the ledge. Her boots sank into the thick, wet mud. The steer, seeing her, panicked again, its horns slashing wildly. She kept her distance, speaking to it in a low, soothing murmur, the same voice she had used on the calf in the sinkhole. She untied the second rope from her belt and began to inch toward the animal's head. The rope held ready in a wide loop. Above, Lane felt the rope go slack as she found her footing. He held his breath, his entire being focused on the thin strand of hemp in his hands. He could hear her voice, a faint, calming murmur on the wind. Rosalind lunged. In one swift, desperate movement, she threw the loop over the steer's massive horns and pulled it tight. The animal bucked, throwing its head back, and a horn caught her on the arm, ripping her sleeve and gashing her skin. She cried out in pain but held on, cinching the knot tight. She stumbled back, her legs sinking deep into the mud, and gave the signal line 2 sharp, desperate tugs. "Pull!" Lane yelled at Joel. They leaned back, their combined weight coming onto the second rope. The rope snapped taut, and the steer, bellowing in fury and pain, was lifted from its feet, its legs scrambling against the cliff face. At the same instant, Rosalind tried to climb, to help Lane pull her up the main line, but the mud on the ledge had the consistency of grease. Her foot slipped. She fell hard against the rock face, her entire weight jerking on the rope around her waist. The bandage on her hand, the one from the cut in the sinkhole, was torn away, and the half-healed gash ripped open. Her grip on the rope slid, her hand slick with mud and fresh blood. Lane felt the slip, the sudden, sickening lurch on the line. He looked down and saw her dangling, her hold failing. A primal roar of negation was ripped from his throat. He abandoned his brace, lunging forward to the very edge of the cliff. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the crumbling rock, and began hauling the rope up hand over hand, his arms and back screaming with the effort. He pulled with a strength born of pure, undiluted terror. She was 10 feet down, then 5. He could see her face, white and strained, her eyes wide. He could see the blood on her hand, on the rope. She was losing her grip. He reached down, his arm extended to its absolute limit. His fingers closed around her wrist like a man-trap. The shock of his grip, the raw power in it, shot through her. His eyes, inches from hers, were not the cold, distant eyes of Lane Mercer the rancher. They were blazing, filled with a terrifying, protective fire. He was not rescuing his herd. He was not saving a hand. He was saving her. Her breath came in a ragged, desperate gasp. The world was spinning, a vortex of pain and fear and the shocking, undeniable reality of his hand clamped around her wrist. "Pull me closer," she breathed. The words a plea, a demand, a surrender. He didn't speak. He just pulled. He heaved her up the last few feet with a single, explosive grunt of effort, his body a coiled spring of power. She came over the edge and collapsed against him, her mud-caked body slumping into his. Their momentum carried them backward, away from the deadly cliff edge, and they fell together in a tangled heap on the wet, cold grass. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged, desperate breathing, the wild, frantic drumming of 2 hearts beating as one. He was on top of her, his weight pinning her to the earth, his hand still locked around her bloody wrist. The roar of the now distant stampede, the crackle of the fire, the howling of the wind had all faded into a dull, distant hum. The world had shrunk to this single point of contact, this desperate, life-affirming collision of two bodies. Then, the tension broke. A sound bubbled up from Rosalind's chest, a hysterical, half-strangled noise that was half a sob and half a laugh. She was alive. They were alive. The sheer, ridiculous improbability of it was overwhelming. Lane, feeling her laughter, or the beginning of it, vibrate through him, was infected by it. A low chuckle rumbled in his own chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. The sound grew, and they were laughing in the rain, which had finally begun to fall in cold, heavy drops, laughing through the pain and the fear and the exhaustion. The shivering that had racked their bodies from cold and terror began to transform, to transmute into a different kind of trembling, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the simple, miraculous fact of being alive, together. He rolled off her, but he didn't let go. He kept his grip on her wrist, as if afraid she might slip away again, and lay beside her on the wet grass, their shoulders touching, their laughter slowly subsiding into quiet, ragged breaths. Joel Vickers approached them cautiously, his face a mixture of awe and concern. He had secured the steer, which now stood trembling on solid ground. He saw them then, lying on the grass. Close, their hands still joined. He saw the look that passed between them in the flickering firelight, an unguarded, raw intimacy that was as private as a prayer. The boy, who had the quiet wisdom of the lonely places, understood. He stopped, averted his gaze, and with a gesture of profound, innate chivalry, he shrugged off his own dry woolen coat. He stepped forward, gently tossed it over their two huddled forms, and then turned and walked quietly away, leaving them to the privacy of the rain and the night. Hours later, when the stampede had been fully contained and the exhausted riders were accounting for their losses, Lane Mercer stood before his men. The fire was a line of smoldering embers, and the rain had turned the dust to mud. His face was streaked with soot and grime. His shirt was torn, but he stood straighter than they had seen him in years. "The losses were small," he said, his voice carrying over the tired assembly. "Thanks to all of you." He paused, and his gaze found Rosalind, who stood shivering under Joel's coat, her arm bandaged with a strip of her own torn dress. But the herd would be at the bottom of the cut if it wasn't for her. She saved the led steer, and she helped turn the herd. The credit for tonight is hers. The men, tired and sore, looked at Rosalind with a new, profound respect. They nodded. They murmured their agreement. It was the highest praise a rancher could give, a public accounting of a debt of courage. Far away, on a high ridge overlooking the entire basin, a man lowered a brass spyglass from his eye. Duke Halvorson sat his horse, a still, black shape against the smoldering skyline. He had watched the entire drama unfold: the fire, the stampede, the desperate fight to turn the herd. He had watched the woman go over the cliff. He had watched Mercer pull her back, and he had watched the young rider cover them with his coat. He had thought he was fighting one man, a broken, stubborn loner. He saw now that he was wrong. He was fighting two. A partnership had been forged in that fire, sealed on that cliff edge, and they were stronger together than they had ever been apart. A slow, cold smile touched his lips, but his eyes, fixed on the distant, huddled figures, were as dark and as cold as the bottom of a well. The aftermath of the stampede was a landscape of mud, exhaustion, and a strange, new quiet. The violence of the night had scoured the air clean, leaving behind an unspoken understanding between Lane and Rosalind, a bond forged in fire and fear. The invisible line that had separated rancher from hired hand had been erased. They were now simply two people allied against a common enemy in a harsh land. This new reality was given a name and a face 2 days later in the form of Mrs. Leda Morrell. She arrived in a sturdy buckboard wagon, a woman whose broad, capable frame seemed as much a part of the landscape as the ancient cottonwoods. Leda Morell was their closest neighbor, a widow who ran her own small spread 10 miles to the east with a pragmatism that bordered on cheerful. She was the basin's unofficial barometer of social decency and its most prolific baker of cornbread. She pulled to a halt, her shrewd, kindly eyes taking in the scene: the repaired fence, the exhausted riders, and the woman in a mended dress standing on the porch of the main house, a place no woman had stood for 4 years. "Heard you had a bit of a party the other night," Leda said, her voice a warm, practical rumble. She handed Roslyn a heavy, cloth-wrapped parcel that radiated a heavenly warmth and the unmistakable scent of baked corn, molasses, and butter. "Figured you could use this. Men who've been up all night fighting fires and fools need a hot meal in them. It's the law of nature." Her gaze flickered from Roslyn to Lane, who had emerged from the barn, his expression guarded. Leda Morell's smile was a knowing, intricate thing. "And it looks like you finally hired someone with the sense to stand on the porch instead of in the dirt. It's about time. Lane Mercer." Lane just grunted, a flush creeping up from under his collar. But he didn't contradict her. He didn't send Roslyn back to the tack room. He stood his ground, and in doing so, acknowledged the change. Leda's visit was a permission slip. With the delivery of that cornbread, a domestic warmth began to seep back into the cold, masculine world of the Mercer outfit. The tack room, with its smells of leather and horse, was no longer Roslyn's only domain. She began to use the cookhouse, a separate building with a large cast-iron stove that hadn't been used for anything more ambitious than boiling coffee in years. Inspired by Leda's offering, Roslyn decided to learn. She found sacks of flour and cornmeal, tins of baking soda, and a crock of lard. Her first attempts at biscuits were dense, flat discs that could have been used to stone a coyote. Her next batch of cornbread was a blackened, smoky brick. The riders, Joel included, ate them without complaint, their loyalty to her now absolute. But Lane saw the frustration in her face. One afternoon, he found her staring at the stove as if it were a mortal enemy, her face smudged with soot. "The heat's not even," she said, her voice tight. "It's a devil on one side and a sleeping dog on the other." Lane looked at the stove, then at the nearly empty wood box beside it. He said nothing, but picked up the axe and went outside. For the next hour, the rhythmic, solid thwack of the axe-splitting wood was a steady counterpoint to the frustrated clatter of pots and pans from inside. He wasn't just chopping firewood. He was splitting pine and cured oak into varying sizes small, fast-burning pieces to get the heat up, and larger, dense logs to maintain it. He brought the wood in, stacking it neatly. "Pine first to heat the iron," he said, his voice rough, avoiding her eyes. "Then the oak to hold it. You have to feed it slow." He was contributing, awkwardly, wordlessly. He was participating in her effort, offering his knowledge of wood and fire to her domestic battle. She watched him, a small, soft smile touching her lips. And the next batch of cornbread she pulled from the oven was golden brown, light and perfect. Their world began to shrink, in the best of ways, to these small, shared moments. The larger threat of Halverson was a constant, low hum on the horizon, but the foreground was filled with the quiet work of living. One quiet, sun-drenched afternoon, with the riders out checking the fences on the far pasture, they found themselves alone in the main barn. The air was warm, smelling of hay and sunlight, filled with the lazy buzzing of flies. Lane was restitching a tear in his heavy winter cloak, his large, calloused fingers clumsy with the small needle. "You're going to sew the sleeve to the collar if you keep on like that," Roslyn said, her voice gentle with amusement. He scowled at the tangled thread. "I can rebuild a wagon from the axle up. I can set a broken leg on a horse. This," he said, holding up the needle as if it were a venomous insect, "is a mystery." "Let me," she offered. She took the cloak from him, along with the needle and thread. She sat on an overturned bucket, The heavy wool pooled in her lap and began to stitch, her movements small, neat, and efficient. He sat on a nearby hay bale, watching her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way the sunlight caught the stray strands of hair that had escaped her bun. He watched her fingers, so capable and sure, weaving the thread, closing the tear, mending the garment that protected him from the cold. She finished the seam and was about to bite the thread when she saw another tear, a smaller one near the hem. "Here's another," she murmured. She began to sew again. They sat in a comfortable, companionable silence, the only sound the soft shush of the needle passing through the wool. It was a sound of healing. Another day, he found her in the corral, struggling with a bridle. She was trying to adjust the bit, but the leather straps were stiff and the buckle was confounding. "You're fighting it," he said, coming up behind her. "It's a Mercer knot. My grandfather designed it. It only works one way." He stood beside her, his proximity making the air feel thick. "Here." He didn't take the bridle from her. Instead, he reached out and covered her hands with his own, guiding them. His hands were huge, warm, and rough, completely engulfing hers. He moved her fingers through the intricate sequence, a loop, a twist, a pull-through. "You see, you have to fold the leather back on itself, then use the tension to lock it. It never slips." His touch was meant to be instructional, but it wasn't. It was a slow fire that spread from her hands up her arms. She was acutely aware of his breath on her hair, the solid wall of his chest so close to her shoulder. She forgot the knot, the leather, the horse. There was only the feeling of his hands, strong and sure, holding hers. When the knot was tied, his hands lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Then he pulled back, as if startled by his own actions, and cleared his throat. "It takes practice," he said gruffly, and turned away, leaving her with the ghost of his touch tingling on her skin. One evening, while cleaning out a dusty corner of the tack room, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic in an old crate. She pulled it out. It was a harmonica, its metal casing tarnished, its wooden comb darkened with age. Curious. She wiped it on her sleeve and put it to her lips. She blew a few tentative, reedy notes. Then, a simple, clear melody emerged, a fragment of a folk song she remembered from her childhood in Ohio. The tune was sweet and lonely, a small, human sound that filled the cavernous silence of the barn. Lane was walking from the bunkhouse when he heard it. He stopped, hidden in the shadows, and listened. He hadn't heard music on this ranch in 5 years, not since Caleb had loved the harmonica. This one had been his. Lane had packed it away with all the other pieces of his brother, unable to look at it, unable to throw it away. He watched Rosalind as she played, her eyes closed, lost in the simple tune. She wasn't playing it with Caleb's boisterous energy. She played it with a gentle, searching quality. She was not erasing a memory. She was giving it a new voice. He felt a sharp, painful pang in his chest, but beneath it was something else, something warm and unfamiliar. He didn't step into the light. He just stood in the darkness and listened. And for the first time in a very long time, Lane Mercer smiled. It wasn't a smile of the mouth. It was a smile of the eyes. The sun was setting later that week, bleeding orange and purple across the vast sky. A cold wind had picked up, rattling the door of the tack room, a lonely, percussive sound. A small pot-bellied stove in the corner, which Rosalind had taken to using, glowed a cheerful, cherry red, pushing back the evening chill. High-hanging saddles cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Lane came to the doorway. He didn't have a reason, no bridle to fetch, no question to ask. He just came. She was sitting on her cot, brushing her hair, the long, dark strands catching the firelight. She looked up and saw him, and a quiet invitation was in her eyes. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut. plunging the room into a warm, intimate twilight lit only by the stove. He sat beside her on the cot. The straw-filled mattress rustled and dipped with his weight. They sat for a long moment in silence, the wind howling outside, the fire crackling inside. The space between them was no longer a chasm of mistrust, but a humming, resonant field of unspoken things. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers gently touched her cheek. His thumb stroked the line of her jaw, a touch as soft and wondering as if he were touching a flame. She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He lowered his head, and she raised hers. Their lips met. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of discovery, of questions asked and answered without words. It was slow, soft, and profound, a coming home to a place neither of them had ever been before. His lips were chapped from the wind, but warm. Her breath mingled with his, tasting of coffee in the clean air. The kiss deepened, a slow, unfolding miracle. His other hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the soft weight of her hair. Her hand came to rest on his chest, right over his heart, feeling its steady, heavy beat. The world outside Halverson, the law, the coming winter, it all fell away. There was only the small, warm room, the glow of the stove, the scent of leather and wood smoke, and this kiss that was mending 100 broken pieces inside both of them. Slowly, gently, he drew back. He rested his forehead against hers. Their eyes still closed. The single kiss had changed everything. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, brimming with a new and fragile truth. He eased them back onto the cot, onto her simple bedroll, pulling a thick wool blanket over them. He held her close, her head finding its natural place in the hollow of his shoulder. She was trembling, or perhaps he was, in the warm, fire-lit darkness. It was impossible to tell. She was surrounded by him, by his strength, by a sense of safety so profound it made her want to weep. She snuggled closer, seeking more, seeking the very center of this newfound warmth. "Pull me closer," she whispered against his chest, the words a soft, urgent plea. Lane went still. The words, so simple, so direct, hit him with the force of a physical blow. For a moment, the old Lane, the man of walls and distances, fought back, but the fight was already lost. He looked down at the woman in his arms, this impossible, courageous woman who had brought light and music and warmth back into his dead world. He didn't answer with words. He shifted, adjusting his hold, pulling the heavy wool blanket up higher, tucking it more securely around her shoulders. It was an act of immense tenderness, his own quiet way of answering her plea. He drew her in until her ear was pressed directly against his chest, until the steady, solid, living rhythm of his heartbeat was the only sound in her world. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of a promise. It was the sound of a house being built. They lay like that for a long time, drifting in a state that was not sleep, but a deep and peaceful communion. Then, a sound from the world outside intruded, faint but sharp on the cold night air, the rhythmic beat of a horse's hooves, moving fast. They both tensed, the spell broken. The sound was a reminder. Their small, warm world was an island, and the sea around it was still dangerous. Lane gently eased himself up, his hand still resting on her shoulder. He looked down at her, his face serious in the dying firelight. The passion of the moment had cooled, but in its place was a clear, sober certainty. He placed his hand on her cheek again, his gaze holding hers. "Stay," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Not as a hired hand, not just until spring." He took a breath, the words costing him more than any amount of gold. "Stay until we're sure of each other." It was not a proposal. It was not a declaration of love. It was something more real, more honest. It was a request to build something, together, on the uncertain ground they shared. Rosalind looked up at him, at this difficult, broken, beautiful man, and her heart felt so full it ached. She nodded, a single, decisive movement. "I'll stay." But even as she said it, a shadow of worry flickered in her eyes. She thought of the letter, sent out into the darkness on a fast horse. She thought of the silence that had followed. Their future was not just their own to decide. It was also in the hands of a judge in a distant town, a man who had not yet answered. The fragile peace was the first casualty. It was murdered by whispers. In the dim, smoky confines of the copper lantern and the dusty aisles of the Sagebrush General Store, a new story took root, planted by Sheriff Pike with the casual malice of a man sowing weeds. "It's the railroad," he'd say, leaning on the counter, his voice a low, confidential rumble. "That new woman of Mercer's, the Pierce woman. She's not just some widow, she's a mapmaker, a railroad spy." He'd let the words hang in the air, thick and poisonous. The railroad was a beast of iron and smoke, a distant, hungry power that the ranchers feared and distrusted. It could bring progress, but it could also bring ruin, swallowing up land and water with an insatiable appetite. "Think about it," Pike would continue, lowering his voice. "She shows up out of nowhere, right when Halverson is trying to secure the water for the town's future. She's got surveyor's tools. She's mapping the whole basin, not for Mercer, but for a corporate office in Chicago. She and Mercer are going to sell the basin's water rights out from under us all." The lie was clever. It twisted Rosalind's competence into a weapon and Lane's stubborn isolation into proof of a secret, treacherous deal. Men who had known Lane his whole life began to look at him with suspicion. The Mercer outfit, once just a lonely place, was now becoming an enemy outpost in their minds. Then came the public spectacle. Halverson, ever the showman, called a town meeting at the grain hall. He stood on a makeshift stage, flanked by a beaming Sheriff Pike, the air thick with the smell of lamp oil and damp wool. He was not there as a predator, he claimed, but as a benefactor. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice smooth and reassuring. "For too long, the growth of Sagebrush Ford has been held back by uncertainty, by squabbles over a creek that belongs to us all." He held up a document, a crisp sheet of legal paper with an impressive-looking seal at the bottom. "I have here a preliminary agreement, a new water rights charter for the entire basin, one that guarantees prosperity for this town, for the mill, for your children." He didn't read the whole document, just a few select, promising phrases. Then he pointed to the bottom, and as you can see, it has already been reviewed and initialed by the Territorial Circuit Judge himself, Judge Hartley. A murmur went through the crowd. This was it, the stamp of official approval. The law was on Halverson's side. Rosalind and Lane stood at the back of the hall, hemmed in by the hostile silence of their neighbors. Rosalind's eyes were fixed on the document in Halverson's hand. He held it up for a long moment, letting the lamplight glint off the page. It was too far to read the text, but she could see the scrawled initials at the bottom, J.H. Something was wrong. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had spent years studying legal documents, deeds, and surveys. She knew the way ink behaved, the way a man in a hurry signed his name. "The ink," she whispered to Lane, her voice so low it was barely a breath. "It's too wet. Look at the way it shines. It hasn't had time to soak into the fiber of the paper. It was signed today." Lane followed her gaze. He couldn't see the detail she saw, but he saw the look on her face, the focused, analytical certainty. "And the signature," she continued, her mind racing. "The loops are too perfect, too practiced. Judge Hartley is an old man. He's been on the circuit for 20 years. His hand would be faster, sloppier. This is a drawing of a signature. It's a forgery." The proof was 100 feet away, a lie held in a confident man's hand, and they were powerless to expose it. They were trapped in a room full of people who had already judged them. They left the meeting in silence, the weight of the town's suspicion a physical cloak on their shoulders. That night, the real attack came. It was a sound that woke Lane from a shallow, restless sleep, a deep, groaning crack of timber, followed by a thunderous, splintering crash that echoed up from the direction of the ravine. It was a sound he knew in his bones, a sound that lived in his nightmares. He was dressed and out the door in a minute, a lantern in one hand, his rifle in the other. Rosalind was right behind him, her face a pale oval in the darkness. They ran, their boots slipping on the cold, damp ground, toward Split Angel Cut, toward the Alderspan Bridge, or what was left of it. The bridge, the one he and Caleb had built, was gone. Not collapsed from rot or flood, but murdered. The two massive central support beams, timbers as thick as a man's chest, had been systematically destroyed. In the swinging, erratic light of the lantern, Lane could see the brutal evidence, the deep, V-shaped cuts of axes, and the finer, more patient lines of a cross-cut saw. The saboteurs had chopped and sawed almost all the way through, leaving just enough wood to hold the bridge's weight until a sudden shift, or the cold of the night, finished the job. The entire central span lay in a tangled, broken heap on the rocks of the ravine below. This was the place, the exact spot where Caleb had fallen. This wasn't just about stopping them from reaching town. This was a message, cruel and deeply personal, aimed directly at Lane's oldest, rawest wound. He stopped at the edge of the chasm. He didn't rage. He didn't curse. A profound, terrifying stillness came over him. He lowered the lantern, setting it on the ground, its yellow light illuminating the raw, splintered ends of the butchered beams. He just stood there, staring into the darkness where his brother had disappeared, his face a granite mask, his breathing so shallow it seemed to have stopped altogether. The past had reached out and strangled the present, and he was lost in it. Rosalind watched him, her heart aching. She saw him retreat into that cold, silent place where no one could reach him. She could have offered words of comfort, of anger, of shared defiance. But she knew that words were useless against a ghost. Instead, she moved to stand beside him. She didn't speak. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. Her touch was a small, warm weight in the vast, cold darkness. It was an anchor. It was a simple, solid fact in a world that had just dissolved into a nightmare of memory. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor, as if waking from a trance. He didn't look at her, but he didn't pull away. He slowly, deliberately, raised his own hand and placed it over hers, his rough, calloused fingers closing over her own. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures against the night, their joined hands a silent testament. The grief that had frozen him began to thaw, and as it did, it transformed. It was no longer a paralyzing weight of guilt and loss. It was hardening, sharpening, cooling into a resolve as pure and as cold as the blade of a knife. Halvorsen had not just destroyed a bridge. He had desecrated a grave, and in doing so, he had made the fight absolute. "We go to Hartley Junction," Lane said, his voice a low, gravelly sound, the first words spoken in half an hour. Now. They had one option, the old, treacherous mining road over Deacon's Pass. It was a 2-day journey by wagon, and the sky was already spitting the first hard pellets of a snowstorm. They had to leave immediately. Joel, his young face grim but resolute, volunteered without being asked. "I can handle the team. Mr. Mercer, I know the pass." They worked in the cold darkness of the barn, their movements swift and purposeful. Joel harnessed the 4 strongest mules to the heavy buckboard wagon. Lane packed rifles and ammunition. Rosalind gathered the evidence, her hand-drawn survey maps, her detailed notes on the water levels, and a new, sworn affidavit detailing the forgery she had witnessed on the document at the grain haul. She wrapped the precious papers in an oilcloth packet. As she climbed onto the wagon seat, Lane came to her side. He handed her the packet of documents. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a complete and total trust that erased all the suspicion that had come before. "Pike will be watching the roads," he said, his voice low and urgent. "He'll try to stop us. He'll come for me. If I'm held up, you keep going. You and Joel, you get these papers to Judge Hartley, no matter what. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said, her own voice steady. "Promise me, Roslyn." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed with the weight of a vow. "I promise, Lane." He nodded once, squeezed her hand, and then swung up onto his buckskin. He would ride ahead, a scout and a decoy. They made it 10 miles before the trap was sprung. The road narrowed as it entered the foothills of the pass, winding through a dense forest of pine and rock. Lane, scouting 100 yards ahead, had just rounded a sharp bend when the rifle shot cracked through the air. It wasn't aimed at him. Behind him, he heard a sharp crack of splintering wood and a yell from Joel. He wheeled his horse around and galloped back. The buckboard was slewed sideways in the road, one of its rear wheels a shattered wreck of broken spokes. Sheriff Pike and 2 of his deputies stepped out from behind a cluster of boulders, rifles held ready. "That's far enough. Mercer," Pike called out, his voice smug. "Wagon's had a bit of an accident. You'll have to come back to town with me to file a report. It could take a while." It was a perfect, simple trap. They were stranded. "Joel, the spare!" Roslyn yelled, already climbing down from the wagon. She pulled the heavy spare wheel from its mounting under the wagon bed. The jack. "There's no time, Miss Pierce!" Joel cried, his eyes wide as he looked at the approaching lawmen. "Make time," she commanded. As Joel scrambled for the heavy iron jack, Roslyn grabbed a rifle from the wagon. She didn't aim it at Pike. She aimed it at a tall, dead pine tree on the cliff face above him. She fired. A huge chunk of bark exploded from the tree, and a shower of splintered wood rained down near the sheriff's feet. Pike and his men jumped back, startled, momentarily raising their rifles toward her. "Just steadying my nerves. Sheriff," she called out, her voice ringing with a confidence she did not feel. "It's been a long night." The shot and the defiance gave Joel the cover he needed. He positioned the jack under the axle and began to crank, his young arms straining. Lane, seeing their plan, dismounted and moved to stand between the wagon and the sheriff, his own rifle held in a casual, non-threatening but ready manner. "This is interference with a lawman, Mercer," Pike snarled. "Is it, Sheriff?" Lane replied, his voice calm. "Or is destroying a man's property on a public road a crime I wonder what Judge Hartley would call it?" The standoff was a stalemate of seconds. Roslyn, her hands raw, her muscles screaming, worked with Joel to wrestle the shattered wheel off and heave the heavy spare onto the axle. They fumbled with the nuts, their fingers numb with cold and adrenaline. Pike, seeing that his simple plan was failing, grew desperate. "That's it, you're all under arrest," he shouted, taking a step forward. It was then that they heard it, the sound of another horse, this one moving at a steady, unhurried trot, coming up the road from the direction of town. A lone rider emerged from the trees. He was an old man, ramrod straight in the saddle, with a severe face, a mane of white hair, and eyes that looked like they had been chipped from ice. He wore the black, dusty coat of a traveling judge. Pike stopped dead. The color drained from his face. Judge Hartley. What are you doing here?" Judge Hartley reined in his horse and looked from Pike's guilty face to the damaged wagon, to the rifles in everyone's hands. His cold gaze missed nothing. "I received a rather compelling letter, Sheriff," the judge said, his voice like the scrape of stone on stone. "An express post from Three Forks. It spoke of boundary disputes, forged documents, and a local lawman who seemed to have forgotten who he works for." He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff but deliberate. "It seems I have arrived just in time. Mercer, I assume you are the man who has been detained." Lane lowered his rifle. "Yes, Your Honor." Hartley's gaze fell upon Sheriff Pike, and it was utterly withering. "By my authority as a circuit judge for this territory, I am placing an immediate and binding injunction on all matters concerning the water rights of the Cold Hare Creek. All claims are frozen. All boundaries will remain as they are currently marked. No water will be diverted. No dams will be built. And no one," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "will be unlawfully detained. A full hearing will be convened at the District Court in Hartley Junction in 2 days. Sheriff, you will ensure that all parties are present. Am I understood?" Pike could only nod, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His authority had vanished, evaporated in the cold glare of a true and honest lawman. He was forced to watch as Rosalind and Joel finished securing the wheel. He was forced to stand aside as Lane took up the reins of the mule team. As the wagon rolled past him, Judge Hartley looked at Lane. "Your father was a good man. Mercer, I trust you have the evidence this letter of yours promises." "We do, Your Honor," Lane said. The judge nodded once. "Then I will see you in court." They had won. Not the war, but a crucial, life-saving battle. They were free, and they were on their way, with the law, finally, on their side. The victory was a brief, sharp glint of sun before the world dissolved into a fury of white. On the high-exposed switchbacks of Deacon's Pass, the snow began not as flakes, but as a horizontal blizzard of ice pellets, driven by a wind that shrieked like a blade being sharpened on stone. The world vanished, replaced by a churning, blinding vortex of gray and white. Joel, his face raw and red, fought to keep the mules on the barely visible track. Lane rode close to the wagon, his form a ghostly shape that appeared and disappeared in the maelstrom. Rosalind, huddled on the wagon seat, felt the cold penetrate to her bones, a deep, invasive chill that no blanket could stop. The lead mule, blinded by the snow and unnerved by the howling wind, suddenly balked. It stumbled, its hoof catching on an unseen rock, and went down in a tangle of harness and panicked kicking. The wagon slewed sideways, its wheels dangerously close to the invisible edge of the pass. "Whoa, whoa, now!" Joel yelled, fighting the reins, his voice snatched away by the gale. Lane was off his horse in an instant, moving through the blinding snow to the head of the team. It took them nearly an hour of brutal, freezing work to cut the fallen mule free and calm the others. But the delay was fatal. The snow was deepening, drifting, erasing the road. To go forward was to risk plunging into the abyss. To go back was to risk freezing in the open. "There," Lane bellowed, pointing to a dark slash in the rock face 100 yards ahead. "An overhang, a cave." It was barely a cave. It was a shallow, concave scoop in the granite cliff, a place where the wind had scoured the rock over 1,000 years, offering a space perhaps 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide. It was little more than a stone eyebrow on the face of the mountain, but it was shelter. They unhitched the remaining mules, leading them and Lane's horse into the relative calm of the hollow, and pulled the wagon in as close as they could to form a windbreak. The storm raged on just feet away, a wall of pure, malevolent motion. While Joel saw to the animals, Lane went to work. He used his axe to splinter a dry crate from the wagon, then added the shattered spokes of the broken wheel. With numb, clumsy fingers, he struck a match, shielding the tiny flame with his body until it caught on a piece of tinder. Slowly, patiently, a small, courageous fire began to grow in the center of their stone refuge, a tiny, defiant star against the crushing darkness and cold. The fire was life. They huddled around it, the three of them, steam rising from their damp clothes. The heat was a miracle, but it couldn't reach the deeper chill that had settled into Rosalind's body. She was shivering uncontrollably, her hands raw from the cliff rescue and the work of changing the wheel, were a dead, bloodless white. She held them out to the flames, but felt nothing. They were just objects at the end of her arms. Lane saw the violent tremors that shook her frame, the bluish tinge of her lips. He moved from his spot across the fire and knelt in front of her. "Give me your hands," he commanded, his voice low and rough. She looked at him, her teeth chattering too hard to speak. She held them out. They were shaking. He didn't take them gently. He took them with a firm, possessive urgency, enclosing both of her small, frozen hands within his own large, calloused ones. He began to rub them, his thumbs pressing hard into her palms, forcing the blood back into the numb tissues. The friction was a distant, theoretical thing at first, but then a wave of excruciating pain, a pins and needles agony, washed over her. She cried out, a small, sharp sound. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's the life coming back. Hold still." He didn't stop. He turned her hands over and began to breathe on them, his breath a hot, focused cloud in the frigid air. He breathed into her cupped palms, over her stiff fingers, his head bowed in a gesture of intense, focused care. She watched him, mesmerized by the intimacy of the act. He was breathing his own warmth, his own life, directly into her. The pain began to subside, replaced by a slow, spreading heat that was more than just physical. It was the heat of his absolute, undivided attention. It was the heat of his will. When her hands were finally pink again, when the shivering had eased to a slight tremor, he didn't immediately let go. He just held them, cupped in his gaze fixed on her face. The firelight played in her eyes, and in their depths, he saw the reflection of the storm, of their shared ordeal, and something else, a profound, trusting vulnerability. The wind howled outside their small sanctuary, a reminder of the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounded them, the fragile warmth of the fire, the smallness of their shelter. Her own lingering tremors, it all combined into a single, overwhelming feeling of fragility. She felt the need for something more solid than a fire, more permanent than a stone overhang. She looked at the space on the bedroll beside him. "Pull me closer," she whispered, her voice husky, almost lost in the shriek of the wind. The words were a direct echo of her plea on the cliff edge. Then, it had been a cry for physical rescue. Now, it was a request for something else entirely. He heard the difference. He understood. He moved, not with the explosive urgency of the rescue, but with a slow, deliberate tenderness. He settled back onto the heavy wool bedroll he had spread near the fire and opened his arm. An invitation. She moved into the space, into the circle of his embrace. He drew her against his side, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, solid and reassuring. It was an embrace that was not about passion, but about shelter. It was as firm and as steady as a fence post in a blizzard. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a deep, shuddering sigh of relief escaping her. The simple, solid reality of him, the wall of his body against the storm, was the safest place in the world. He was warm, he was real, and he was here. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire, listening to the storm rage. The silence between them was no longer awkward or charged. It was a shared space, a comfortable quiet. He was the first to move, shifting slightly to look down at her. Her face, tilted up toward his, was illuminated by the soft, golden light of the fire. The exhaustion, the fear, the lines of hardship, they were all still there, but they were softened, gentled by the light. He lowered his head. She met him halfway. The kiss was as soft and as quiet as the falling snow ought to be. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared survival. It was long and sweet, unhurried. There was a moment in the middle where they drew back, just enough to breathe, just enough for a small, shy smile to pass between them. a silent acknowledgement of the miracle of this moment. Then their lips found each other again. A confirmation, a seal on a pact that had been made without words. When the kiss finally ended, they didn't pull apart. She rested her head on his chest, and he held her, his chin resting on the top of her head. The world was right, in the midst of a deadly storm, trapped in a shallow cave. Everything, for the first time, was exactly as it should be. "I used to dream of a house," she whispered against the rough wool of his coat, her voice dreamy with warmth and fatigue. "Back in Ohio, it was a proper house, with white curtains and a porch." He was silent for a moment, his hand stroking her hair. "What kind of house do you dream of now?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beneath her ear. "It's smaller now," she said. "It's made of pine logs from the high country. It has a stone chimney, and it's built on the rise overlooking Cold Hare Creek, where the wild roses grow in June." He smiled, a real smile that she could feel more than see. "That's a good spot," he murmured. "It catches the morning sun." "It has a wide front porch," she continued, her voice growing stronger as the vision took shape in her mind. "And on the post, by the door, there's a hook, for an old, worn-out saddle, not for decoration, for a reminder of where we came from." He tightened his arm around her. The image was so clear, so real, he could almost smell the pine and see the sun on the water. He saw the house. He saw her in it. He saw himself coming home to it. The thought was so powerful, so overwhelming after years of emptiness, that it felt like a prayer. From now on, he thought, a silent vow made to her and to whatever power listened in the storm. "This heart is your warm place." He eased her down onto the bedroll, lying beside her, pulling the other half of the heavy blanket over them both. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. In the quiet intimacy of the firelight, the walls came down completely. "I have a scar," he said, his voice quiet. "On my leg. From a branding iron when I was 15. I was stupid, trying to show Caleb I was fast." "I have one on my shoulder," she replied, her voice just as soft. "From a pot of boiling water when I was a girl. I was trying to help my mother and got in the way." He turned her hand over in his thumb tracing the pale, puckered line of the gash from the cliff rescue. It was a new scar, one they shared. He gently raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, a gesture of reverence. They lay like that, their hands intertwined, their bodies a shared bastion of warmth against the cold. They talked. They told each other the stories of their lives, not in grand narratives, but in the small, etched details of their scars, both the visible and the invisible. He spoke of his brother, not of the fall, but of the way Caleb laughed, of the way he could make a horse trust him. She spoke of her father, of his quiet kindness, and of the crushing, silent disappointment of her arranged marriage. They were confessions whispered into the heart of the storm, secrets given for safekeeping. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song. Inside, the fire crackled and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The heat, the soft murmur of their voices, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart beneath her ear. It all began to blur, to soften. The sharp edges of the world faded, and they drifted into a shared, peaceful sleep, two halves of a whole, finally at rest. The world returned with the crunch of boots on fresh snow. Lane was awake instantly, his body tensing, his hand reaching for the rifle that lay beside him. The fire was a bed of pale, gray embers. Through the mouth of the cave, he could see a world transformed. The storm had passed. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun, just cresting the peaks, was shattering into a million points of diamond light on a pristine, untouched blanket of deep snow. It was Joel. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his face etched with relief. Behind him were two more of the Mercer riders. Rosalind stirred, awakened by his movement. For a moment, she was disoriented. her eyes soft with sleep. Then she saw Joel, and the memory of where they were and who they were came rushing back. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. Slowly, they sat up. The intimacy of the night was a palpable, living thing between them. But the arrival of the others had changed the air. It was no longer a private world of two. They stood, and a small, respectful distance opened up between them. They did not touch. They did not even look at each other for more than a fleeting second. But the way they stood, the way they moved in concert to greet the riders, spoke of a new, unspoken alignment. Their connection had not vanished in the light of day. It had simply become a quiet, powerful current that flowed between them, visible only to those who knew how to look. "We saw the smoke from the lower pass," Joel said, his eyes flicking from Lane to Roslyn and back again, his expression carefully neutral. "We were worried." "The lead mule went down," Lane explained, his voice all business now. "The wagon's axle is cracked. We'll need to ride the rest of the way." As the men set about seeing to the animals and preparing for the ride, Lane turned to Roslyn. The others were busy, their backs to them. For a brief moment, they were alone again. "Roslyn," he said, his voice low. She met his gaze. His eyes were clear, serious. "After the trial," he said, the words coming out slow and deliberate, as if he were laying foundation stones. "When this is all over, I want to ask you to stay." He paused, and his next words were the most important. "Not as a hired hand, not as my tally keeper." Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She waited. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, finishing the thought. "As the mistress of this ranch, as my partner." She held his gaze, her own expression unreadable. The night had been a dream, a fire-lit miracle born of crisis. But the morning was cold and real. The world of courtrooms and neighbors and long, hard days was waiting for them. "I'll stay," she said, her voice as quiet and as serious as his. She took a small step closer. "I'll stay if what we found here, in this cave, is real. If we belong to each other out in the sunlight, too, not just when we're hiding from a storm. I'll stay if we belong to each other beyond the firelight." He didn't need to answer. She saw it in his eyes. The promise was made. The real trial was about to begin. Barnaby Hall was not a courtroom. It was a place for grain auctions and town dances. And it smelled of old dust, sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of spilled molasses from 100 Saturday nights. But on this day, it was the seat of justice for the Sagebrush Basin. The space had been transformed. A long trestle table, draped in a respectable black cloth, served as the judge's bench. The townsfolk, every last one of them, were crammed onto rough-hewn wooden benches, their faces a pale, anonymous sea in the dim light. The air was thick and heavy, a mixture of damp wool from coats still wet with melted snow, the sharp tang of kerosene from the wall lamps, and the electric animal scent of collective anxiety. The only sounds were the restless creak of the benches and the steady, rhythmic drumming of a cold rain against the high tin roof. At the front, there were two camps. On one side sat Duke Halverson, looking as immaculate and unruffled as he had in his carriage. Beside him was a man no one in Sagebrush had ever seen before. He was Silas Croft, a lawyer from Helena, a man whose expensive suit and polished city shoes were an affront to the muddy floorboards. Croft was all smooth, predatory confidence, his briefcase full of papers and legal traps. Beside them, looking diminished and uncomfortable in his Sunday best, sat Sheriff Aldous Pike. On the other side sat Lane and Roslyn. They did not have a lawyer. They had a stack of oilcloth-wrapped papers and the unadorned truth. Joel Vickers sat on the bench just behind them, his knuckles white where he gripped his hat. They were an island in a sea of suspicion, the focus of every curious, hostile, or uncertain gaze in the room. Judge Hartley entered, and the room fell silent. He was the law, old and unbending, and his presence filled the hall with a gravity that 1,000 sheriffs could not command. "This is a preliminary hearing," he announced, his voice a dry rustle that carried to every corner. "Not a trial by jury. That may or may not come later. Today, we will hear evidence pertaining to the disputed water rights of the Coldhair Creek. Mr. Croft, as you represent the complainant, you may begin." Silas Croft rose, a picture of urbane condescension. "Thank you, Your Honor." His voice was a practiced, melodious instrument. He began not with a discussion of water, but with an assassination of character. He called Sheriff Pike to the stand. Pike, coached and polished, was a different man from the blustering bully on the road. He spoke of Lane Mercer's well-known reclusiveness since the tragic accident that claimed his brother. He painted a picture of a man unhinged by grief, prone to paranoia and irrational behavior. Then he turned his attention to Roslyn. "And this woman, this Roslyn Pierce," Croft said, gesturing toward her as if she were a piece of evidence. "Sheriff, in your official capacity, what do you know of her?" "She's an outsider, sir," Pike said, his voice oozing false sincerity. "Appeared out of nowhere a few weeks back, carries surveyor's tools. It's common talk, sir, that she's an agent for the Northern Pacific Railroad, here to map the basin for a new line that would require extensive water rights." The lie, spoken under the roof of justice, landed with a sickening thud. A low, angry murmur went through the crowd. This confirmed their worst fears. "And it is this woman," Croft continued, his voice rising, "this railroad agent, who has been advising the unstable Mr. Mercer to challenge a legal and binding agreement, an agreement that will bring prosperity to every man and woman in this room, an agreement, Your Honor, that you yourself have sanctioned." He dramatically produced the forged document, laying it on the judge's bench. No further questions. Judge Hartley looked at the paper, his face impassive. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "you will approach." Roslyn stood. She walked to the bench, not with the swagger of a lawyer, but with the quiet, steady purpose of a cartographer. She did not look at the hostile crowd. She looked only at the judge. "Mr. Croft makes a serious accusation," Hartley said, his icy eyes fixed on her. "Are you an agent of the railroad?" "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I am a widow who was taught the trade of surveying by her late husband. I am employed by Mr. Mercer." "And you have been advising him in this matter?" "I have been presenting him with the facts of the land and the law. Your Honor, the facts are on his side." She began. She unrolled her own hand-drawn map of the basin, the one from the rise by the windmill. She laid it flat on the bench. "This, Your Honor, is the watershed of the Coldhair, as it currently exists." Then she unrolled the survey notes she and Joel had meticulously recorded. "And this is the evidence of our survey, locating the 1876 high water mark as stipulated in the original Sagebrush Water Charter." She presented her logbook, the dated record of the water levels before the gauge was destroyed. "And this is the record of the creek's flow, before Mr. Halverson's men began their work." Croft was on his feet. "Objection. These are meaningless scribbles, amateur drawings with no legal standing." "They are data, Mr. Croft," Roslyn said, not looking at him. "And they tell a story." Her voice grew stronger, more confident. "They tell the story of a creek that belongs to this basin. A story that this document," she said, her finger now pointing directly at Halverson's prized agreement, "is trying to erase." She leaned forward, her voice dropping, drawing the entire room into a focused, intense silence. "Your Honor, I am a surveyor. I work with paper and ink. The document, Mr. Croft has presented is a forgery." A collective gasp went through the hall. Croft began to bluster, but Judge Hartley raised a single, commanding hand. "Explain yourself, Mrs. Pierce." "The ink of the signature, the initials J.H., she said, "is surface ink. It has not fully oxidized. It was applied within the last 48 hours. Furthermore, the character of the strokes, the pressure, the loop of the J. It is a careful, precise imitation. It is not the signature of a man who has signed his name 10,000 times. It is the work of a man copying a signature he has seen, perhaps on an old court filing. The hall was dead silent. Every eye was on Judge Hartley. His face was a mask of stone. He stared at the document, then at Roslyn. "Bailiff," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Go to the town clerk's office. Bring me the land grant registry for the year 1885. The page concerning the Miller Creek dispute." The bailiff scurried out. Silas Croft was pale. Halverson sat perfectly still, his smile gone, his eyes like chips of ice. The 5 minutes it took for the bailiff to return felt like 5 years. He came back carrying a massive, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Judge Hartley opened it, his fingers finding the correct page. He slid the book across the bench until it lay beside Halverson's document. "Mrs. Pierce," he said. "Approach." She stood beside him. He pointed to the bottom of the old page. "Is this my signature?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "And is this?" he asked, pointing to the new document. "My signature?" "No, Your Honor," she said. "It is not." The difference was undeniable. The old signature was a quick, confident scrawl, the ink a faded, brownish-black that had sunk deep into the paper. The new one was a stark, glossy black, a perfect but lifeless copy. The forgery was plain for all to see. "Joel Vickers," the judge called out. Joel walked to the stand, his boots echoing in the silent hall. He told his story simply, honestly. He told of carrying the mail, of the letter falling, of seeing the distinctive wax seal of Duke Halverson on a letter addressed to Sheriff Pike. The noose was tightening. Judge Hartley turned his cold gaze on the sheriff. "Mr. Quayle," he called out. "Eddie Quayle. Is he present?" Eddie Quayle, who had been slouched in the back, tried to make himself invisible. The bailiff found him and escorted him to the front. He stood before the judge, terrified. "Mr. Quayle," Hartley said, his voice deceptively gentle. "You were recently discharged from the employ of Mr. Mercer. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir, Your Honor." "Tell me why." Quayle looked from the judge to Sheriff Pike, then to Halverson. He was trapped. I don't recall." "Let me refresh your memory," the judge said, his voice hardening. "It involved a water gauge, a gauge that was smashed to pieces in the middle of the night, a gauge whose destruction would have been of great benefit to Mr. Halverson's claim. Now, you can tell me the truth, Mr. Quayle, and I will take your cooperation into account. Or you can lie to this court, and I will see you spend the next 5 years breaking rocks in the territorial prison for perjury. The choice is yours." Eddie Quayle broke. The words came tumbling out, a torrent of confession. "It was the Sheriff Pike. He paid me $20 to do it. He said Mr. Halverson wanted it done, wanted no record of the water level." The room erupted. The dam of suspicion had broken, and now a flood of outrage was directed at Pike and Halverson. The men who had shunned Lane now looked at him with shame and a dawning respect. Duke Halverson finally rose. The mask of civility was gone. His face was a thundercloud of cold, aristocratic fury. He ignored the judge, speaking directly to the crowd, to the ranchers whose trust he had just lost. "This is a circus," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "A misunderstanding. Clearly, there has been some overzealousness on the part of my associates." He reached into his coat and pulled out his thick leather wallet. "To show my good faith, I am prepared to make a contribution, $1,000, to a fund for the town's improvement. Let us forget this unpleasantness and move forward, together." He was trying to buy them. He was treating their justice like an auction. And for the first time, the people of Sagebrush saw him not as a benefactor, but as a baron who believed their loyalty, their land, and their souls were all for sale. A low hiss of derision went through the crowd, a sound of scorn and rejection that was more damning than any verdict. It was then that Lane stood up. He had been silent throughout the entire proceeding. He walked to the center of the room. He did not address the judge. He addressed his neighbors. His voice was not loud. It was the quiet, rough voice of a man who worked the land. "My family has been on this creek for 50 years, he began. He looked at the faces in the crowd, men he had known his whole life. We've had good years, and we've had years so bad we ate boiled leather to survive. But we never fought over the water." He took a breath, his gaze sweeping the room. "The cold hair isn't a line on a map. It's not an asset in a ledger. It's the blood of this land. It waters the herds of every man in this room, rich or poor. The water flows for everyone." He turned, and for the first time, he looked directly at Duke Halverson. "Anyone who tries to cage that river is trying to cage the heart of this country, and the heart of this country is not for sale." He said nothing more. He walked back to his seat and sat down next to Roslyn. The silence that followed was profound, a shared moment of understanding and shame among the townspeople. Judge Hartley brought his gavel down with a sharp, final crack. "This hearing is concluded," he announced. "Based on the evidence presented, I am issuing the following temporary orders." His voice rang out like hammer blows. "First, the injunction on the Cold Hare Creek water rights will remain in full force. The traditional, historical rights of access, as defined by the 1876 Charter, are hereby affirmed until such time as a full jury trial can be convened. That trial," he said, looking at the calendar, "will begin tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Second, Aldous Pike," he said, fixing the sheriff with a glare of pure ice. "You are hereby suspended from your duties as sheriff of Sagebrush Ford, pending an investigation into witness tampering, conspiracy, and destruction of property. You will surrender your badge and your firearm to the bailiff. Now." Pike, his face the color of ash, unpinned his badge and unbuckled his gun belt, his movement stiff with humiliation. "As for you, Mr. Halverson," the judge said, "I strongly advise you to remain in town until the conclusion of tomorrow's trial." Halverson did not look at the judge. He looked at Lane, and his eyes were filled with a cold, murderous promise. He turned on his heel and strode from the hall, Silas Croft scurrying behind him. At the doorway, he paused and looked back at Lane. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice a low, venomous threat. "You may have won in this barn, but you will lose outside the court." He was gone. The people of the town began to file out, their faces a mixture of relief, guilt, and a new, quiet respect for the man they had been so quick to condemn. They nodded at Lane as they passed, murmuring his name. They were his neighbors again. Soon, the hall was empty. There was only Lane and Roslyn, standing in the middle of the room. The dust motes danced in the long, slanted shafts of late afternoon sun that pierced the gloom. The air smelled of rain and cold, red dust. The storm had passed. He looked at her. She looked at him. No words were necessary. They had faced the town, faced the law, faced the ghosts of the past, and they had done it together. They had won. He didn't reach for her. She didn't move toward him. They just stood there, in the quiet, dusty hall, and the look that passed between them spoke of battles won, of promises kept, and of the sure and certain knowledge that the final, most dangerous fight was still to come. The rain that had drummed on the roof of Barnaby Hall all day turned into a cold, persistent drizzle as night fell. The town of Sagebrush Ford was quiet, a collective breath held in anticipation of the morning's verdict. But Lane Mercer could not rest. The victory in the courtroom felt hollow, temporary. Halverson's parting threat. "You will lose," outside the court, echoed in his mind. It was not the promise of a legal appeal. It was the promise of a fight in the dark. He stood by the window of the small room they had taken at the town's only hotel, staring out at the muddy street. Rosalind sat by the small stove, the oilcloth packet of their evidence resting on the table beside her. The intimacy of the cave on Deacon's Pass felt a world away, a fragile dream threatened by the coming dawn. "He's not a man who accepts defeat," she said, her voice a quiet thread in the room. "He won't wait for the jury." "I know," Lane replied, his hand resting on the cool wooden stock of his rifle. "He'll make his move tonight. He has to." He had sent Joel and the other riders to patrol the ranch, but he knew the real threat wasn't to his cattle or his barn. It was to the creek itself, the heart of the country. He had called it, and Halverson was a man who knew how to cut a heart out. It was Rosalind who heard it first. In a lull between the drumming of the rain and the sighing of the wind, she went utterly still. "Listen," she whispered. Lane strained his ears. At first, there was nothing. Then he caught it, a faint, rhythmic, scraping sound, carried on the night air from the direction of the creek. It was the sound of heavy, wet timber being dragged over rock, a sound that had no place in the natural symphony of the night. "The Narrows Bend," Lane said, his voice a low, hard whisper. It was the spot she had pointed out on her map weeks ago, the perfect place to choke the creek. There was no need for discussion, no time for a plan. They moved. Lane grabbed his rifle and a heavy coil of rope. Rosalind, her face set and pale, took a small, sharp hand axe and a grappling hook they had brought with the wagon gear. They didn't wake the town. This was a fight that had to be met in the shadows. They found Joel and 2 other loyal riders, Silas and a quiet man named Pete, keeping watch by the corral. Their horses were already saddled. "We heard it too, boss," Joel said, his young face grim. "Sounds like a work crew." They rode out, 5 shadows against the darkness, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by the wet earth. The rain intensified, plastering their hair to their faces and soaking through their coats. As they drew closer to the Narrows Bend, the scraping sounds were joined by the muffled thud of mallets and the low, grunted commands of men at hard labor. They dismounted 100 yards away and crept forward on foot, using the thick, dripping willows as cover. The scene that met them was a nightmare vision from a hellish, torchlit world. In the narrowest part of the gorge, a dozen of Halverson's men, led by a brutish, bull-necked foreman Lane recognized as Cray Mullen, were working with a frantic, desperate speed. They had built a crude but effective dam from heavy, pre-cut pine logs, wedging them against the rock walls of the gorge and hammering them into place. They were already diverting the main flow of the Cold Hare Creek into a shallow, newly dug channel that led away from the basin and toward Halvorson's own dry lands. By dawn, the Mercer Ranch, and the ranches of all his neighbors, would be cut off from their lifeblood. "He's stealing the river," Joel breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and outrage. "We have to stop them," Lane said, his voice a low command. "We don't fight the men. We fight the dam. Silas, Pete, you take the east bank. Create a diversion. Joel, you're with me. Rosalind, stay back. Stay hidden." But Rosalind shook her head, her eyes blazing in the torchlight. She held up the grappling hook. "The central pin," she whispered, pointing. "They've locked the main timbers together with a single, massive iron pin. If we can pull it, the pressure of the water will do the rest." Lane looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He saw the surveyor, the strategist. He nodded once, a gesture of complete trust. "Get it done." Silas and Pete let out a series of wild, whooping yells from the far bank, firing their pistols into the air. Mullen's men, startled, grabbed their own weapons, their attention diverted, their dark forms outlined against the torches. It was the opening they needed. Lane and Joel burst from the willows, not with guns firing, but with ropes swinging. Lane's lariat snaked out and snagged the end of a heavy log that was being levered into place. "Pull!" he roared, and he and Joel dug their heels into the muddy bank, putting their weight against the rope. The log, half set, swung wildly, knocking two men off their feet and into the icy water. The fight devolved into a chaotic, primitive brawl. It was a battle of leverage and brute force, fought in the pouring rain. Illuminated by sputtering torches, men slipped and fell in the slick mud, their grunts and curses lost in the roar of the diverted water. Lane, moving with a cold, focused fury, found himself face to face with Cray Mullen. The foreman was a giant of a man, and he swung a heavy wooden mallet like a club. Lane ducked under the blow and drove his shoulder hard into the man's gut. They went down together, rolling in the mud and the shallows, their fight a desperate, wordless struggle of fists and muscle. While the brawl raged, Rosalind moved, unseen. She slipped along the edge of the gorge until she was directly above the center of the dam. The water surged and churned below her. She could see the linchpin, its heavy iron rings slick with rain. She secured her rope to a thick root, lowered the grappling hook, and began to swing it, a pendulum of iron over the chaos. Once, twice, it missed, glancing off the wet logs. On the third swing, the hook caught, its metal prongs biting deep into the iron ring of the pin. "Joel!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the din. "The rope pull!" Joel, seeing her, disengaged from his own struggle and scrambled to her side. They grabbed the rope. Their combined weight and desperate strength pitted against the immense, groaning pressure of the wood and water. The rope went taut as a bowstring. "Heave!" Rosalind cried, her muscles screaming, the fibers of the rope cutting into her raw hands. The pin groaned. It resisted, held fast by 1,000 tons of pressure. Then, with a sudden, sharp shriek of protesting metal, it moved. It slid, inch by agonizing inch, and then it came free. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The heart of the dam was gone. The central logs, their anchor gone, bowed outward under the immense force of the pent-up creek, with a sound like a cannon shot. A single timber splintered, and then the entire structure disintegrated in a volcanic eruption of water and wood. The Cold Hare Creek, freed, roared through the breach, a torrent of righteous fury that swept the broken timbers, the tools, and two of Halverson's screaming men downstream into the darkness. A stunned, dripping silence fell over the gorge, broken only by the triumphant roar of the liberated river. Lane, his face bloody, his knuckles raw, climbed to his feet. Cray Mullen groaning in the mud beside him. "It is over, Mercer," a cold, familiar voice said. Duke Halverson stood on the bank, a fine, long-barreled pistol in his hand. The pistol was not aimed at Lane. It was aimed directly at Rosalind. "You have won the battle of mud and sticks," Halverson said, his voice calm, almost conversational, but his eyes were pits of black hatred. "But I will win the war. You have cost me a great deal of time and money. Mrs. Pierce, a debt I intend to collect." Lane started to move toward him, but the sharp, metallic click of the pistol's hammer being cocked froze him in his tracks. They were at an impasse, a deadly tableau in the rain. "I wouldn't," a new voice said, a voice as cold and as hard as a judge's gavel. From the path behind Halverson, Judge Hartley emerged, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in his hands, and behind him, carrying lanterns and rifles, were a dozen men from the town. They had heard the commotion, seen the torches, and had come to see the final act of the play for themselves. Their faces, illuminated by the lanterns, were hard, grim, and utterly united. Halverson stared, his composure finally shattering. He was no longer a baron surrounded by hired muscle. He was a criminal, caught in the act, witnessed by the law and the very people he had tried to swindle. His gaze darted from the judge to the armed ranchers, and he knew, with a certainty that drained the blood from his face, that he was utterly, irrevocably beaten. Duke Halverson, Judge Hartley said, his voice ringing with the full weight of the law. "You are under arrest for the willful and malicious destruction of public waterworks, for conspiracy, and for attempting to subvert the due process of this court. Bailiff, take his weapon." Halverson did not resist. He let the pistol be taken from his hand, his face a mask of disbelief. As he was led away, his fine suit soaked and muddy, the former Sheriff Pike, who had been hiding among the onlookers, stepped forward and, without a word, handed his own surrendered badge to the judge, a final, pathetic admission of his own complicity and defeat. The dawn came, soft and clean. The rain had washed the world new, and the sky was a pale, promising shade of gold. The Cold Hare Creek, its voice a happy, gurgling song, flowed clear and true in its old channel, the sunlight glinting off its surface. The broken, ugly remnants of the dam were a bad memory, already being carried away by the current. Lane and Rosalind stood on the rise, the one where she had first drawn her map, the one with the view of the wild roses. They were exhausted, bruised, and covered in mud, but they were victorious. The land was safe. The water was free. He turned to her. There were no grand speeches left, no more battles to be fought. There was only the quiet, simple truth. "Stay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Stay as mistress of this house, as its heart." She looked up at him, at his battered, beautiful face, and her own heart felt as full and as free as the river below. She stepped forward, closing the small space between them, and rested her forehead against his. "Pull me closer," she whispered, the words a final, complete surrender to the home she had found in his arms. He did. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him, and in the golden light of the new day, he kissed her. The townspeople, who had gathered at a respectful distance, saw the embrace. They saw the end of the fight and the beginning of a life, and one by one, with small, knowing smiles, they turned and quietly walked away, leaving them to their peace. The small house of pine logs was built that next spring, on the rise overlooking the creek, an old, worn saddle, a reminder of a hard-won fight, hung from a hook on the porch post. In the evenings, the sweet, lonely sound of a harmonica would often drift on the air as the sun went down. Lane and Rosalind worked the ranch side by side, their love a quiet, steady thing. A partnership built not on grand declarations, but on shared labor, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding strength. It was a love that didn't need to be shouted. It was lived, every day, in the turning of the seasons, and every night, when the cold wind blew down from the high peaks, when the ghosts of the past whispered at the edges of the firelight. She would only have to murmur the words that had become their private prayer, "Pull me closer," and he would shift on the bedroll, gathering her in, holding her safe, keeping the solemn promise of a heart that had finally, against all odds, found its way home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a thumbs up, and consider hitting the hype button to help more people discover and enjoy our tales.